I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never thought a baby stroller could be the beginning of a nightmare. But as I huddled in my darkened apartment, listening to the sound of someone trying to pick the lock on my front door, I realized how wrong I'd been. It all started 2 weeks ago. I just moved to Chicago with my 6-month-old daughter, Emma. Money was tight, and I needed a stroller. New ones were way out of my budget. So I turned to Craigslist. After scrolling through countless listings, I found one that looked perfect. A gently used up-a-baby cruise, half the retail price. The seller, Susan, lived just a few neighborhoods over. I messaged her, and we arranged to meet at her apartment the next day. As I drove there, Emma cooing in her car seat, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. I'd never bought anything off Craigslist before, but surely it would be fine. It was just a stroller, after all. Susan's apartment was in a part of town I wasn't familiar with. The buildings were older, paint peeling, with bars on the windows. I double-checked the address, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. A woman in her mid-30s answered, smiling warmly. "You must be Anna," she said. "Come on in. I'm Susan." I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, holding Emma close. The apartment was cluttered but clean, toys scattered across the floor. A toddler peered at us from behind the couch. "That's my little one, Zoe," Susan said, gesturing to the child. "She just turned 3. They grow up so fast, don't they?" I nodded, relaxing a bit. "They really do. Emma here is already 6 months. I can hardly believe it." Susan led me to the living room where the stroller stood. It looked even better than in the photos, barely a scratch on it. As I examined it, Susan chatted about her kids, asked me questions about Emma. It felt normal, nice even. After a bit of small talk and a test run pushing the stroller around the apartment, I handed over the cash. Susan helped me carry it down to my car. "Drive safe," she said as I strapped Emma in. "There are some crazy drivers out there." I waved goodbye, feeling pleased with my purchase. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized how odd that last comment had been. How did she know which direction I was going? I shook off the thought. I was being paranoid. Susan was just being friendly, that's all. The next few days were uneventful. The stroller worked perfectly, and I started to forget about the slightly strange interaction with Susan. But then, on day 4, I noticed something odd. I was walking Emma to the park when I saw a car parked across the street. It was a nondescript sedan, dark blue or black. What caught my attention was the driver. He seemed to be watching me. When I looked directly at him, he quickly turned away. I picked up my pace and heart beating a little faster. At the park, I kept glancing around, but the car was nowhere to be seen. I told myself I was imagining things. But the next day I saw it again. Same car, same spot. This time, when I looked, the driver didn't look away. He just stared, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. I hurried back home, pushing the stroller faster than usual. Emma started to fuss, picking up on my anxiety. As soon as I got inside, I locked the door and called my best friend, Lisa. "Am I going crazy?" I asked after explaining the situation. "Maybe I'm just sleep-deprived and seeing things." Lisa's voice was concerned. "I don't think you're crazy, Anna. That definitely sounds creepy. Have you seen the car any other times?" I thought back. Now that you mention it, I think I might have. I didn't pay much attention before, but a chill ran down my spine. Oh God, Lisa. What if they've been following me this whole time? "Okay, let's not panic," Lisa said, though I could hear the worry in her voice. "It could still be a coincidence, but just in case, maybe you should vary your routine for a few days. See if anything changes." I agreed, and we made plans for Lisa to come over that weekend. After hanging up, I went to check on Emma. She was sleeping peacefully in her crib, unaware of her mother's growing fear. The next day, instead of our usual morning walk, I drove to a coffee shop in a different neighborhood. As I sat by the window, sipping my latte and watching Emma babble in her stroller, I started to relax. Maybe I had been overreacting. Then I saw it. The car. It was parked across the street, half hidden behind a delivery truck. My hand started to shake, causing my coffee to slosh over the rim of the cup. I grabbed my phone, ready to call Lisa, or the police, or anyone. But as I looked back up, the car was pulling away. I caught a glimpse of the driver. It was a man, different from the one I'd seen before. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. Was that a car door closing outside? Footsteps on the stairs? I checked the locks a dozen times, pulled the curtains tight, and kept Emma's crib right next to my bed. In the morning, bleary-eyed and exhausted, I made a decision. I needed to know what was going on. I called in sick to work and asked my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to watch Emma for a few hours. "Are you sure you're all right, dear?" Mrs. Chen asked as I handed Emma over. "You look terrible." I forced a smile. "Just a little under the weather. I'm going to see the doctor." Instead, I drove to Susan's apartment. I didn't have a plan exactly. I just knew I needed answers, and this was where it had all started. As I parked across the street, I saw Susan coming out of her building. She was alone, no sign of her daughter. I slouched down in my seat, watching as she got into a car, the same dark sedan I'd been seeing everywhere. My heart pounded as I followed her. She drove to a rundown strip mall on the outskirts of the city. As she got out of her car, a man approached her. They talked for a few minutes, their body language tense. Then Susan handed him an envelope, and he gave her a small package in return. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was Susan involved in something illegal? And what did it have to do with me? I was so focused on Susan and the man that I didn't notice another car pulling up behind me until it was too late. A sharp tap on my window made me jump. A man with a hard face and cold eyes gestured for me to roll down the window. My hands shaking, I complied. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, though I was pretty sure he wasn't a cop. "Get out of the car," he said, his voice low and threatening. I considered making a run for it, but where would I go? Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out. The man grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" he growled. "You had to go poking around." He started dragging me toward Susan's car. She was watching, her face a mask of guilt and fear. "Please," I begged. "I don't know what's going on. I have a baby at home. Please, just let me go." The man's grip tightened. "Shut up. You're coming with us." Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars swarmed into the parking lot, officers jumping out with guns drawn. "Police! Freeze!" Everything happened so fast after that. The man tried to run but was tackled by an officer. Susan burst into tears, falling to her knees with her hands up. I stood there, shaking, as an officer approached me. "Are you Anna Thompson?" he asked. When I nodded, he continued. "We've been investigating this group for months. Your friend Lisa called us when you didn't return her calls. She was worried." I let out a sob of relief. Lisa, my wonderful, paranoid, life-saving best friend. Over the next few hours, I learned the truth. Susan was part of a criminal ring that used Craigslist to find targets for burglary and identity theft. The stroller had been bugged with a GPS tracker. They'd been following me, learning my routine, planning to rob me. As I sat in the police station, giving my statement, all I could think about was Emma, my beautiful, innocent daughter, who had unknowingly been in danger this whole time. When I finally got home, I hugged Emma so tight she started to squirm. Mrs. Chen hovered anxiously, full of questions I wasn't ready to answer. That night, as Emma slept peacefully in her crib, I sat by the window jumping at every sound. The police had assured me it was over, that everyone involved had been arrested, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I looked at the stroller, still sitting in the corner of the room. Tomorrow, I would get rid of it, buy a new one, even if I had to max out my credit card. But for now, in the quiet of the night, I allowed myself to cry, for the fear I'd felt, for the trust I'd lost, and for the realization that sometimes the most ordinary things can lead us into extraordinary danger. As I wiped my eyes, I made a promise to myself and to Emma. I would be more careful, yes, but I wouldn't let fear rule our lives. We had survived, and we would be stronger for it. But I was never ever buying anything off Craigslist again. I never thought I'd find hell in paradise, but as I crouched in the darkness, listening to the voices of killers, I realized how quickly heaven could turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip, a chance to clear my head after a messy breakup and the stress of city life. I'd always loved the outdoors, the peace and quiet of nature. So when I found a trail in a remote part of the Rockies, it seemed perfect. 3 days of solitude, just me and the wilderness. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The air was crisp and clean, the views breathtaking. I hiked until my legs ached, setting up camp as the sun began to set. As I sat by my small fire, watching the stars appear one by one, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. It was on the second day that everything changed. I'd been hiking for hours, the trail becoming less defined as I ventured deeper into the wilderness. The trees seemed to grow thicker, the underbrush more dense. I was considering turning back when I saw it, a small clearing ahead, and in it, what looked like an old cabin. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles. The cabin was weather-beaten, its wood gray with age. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The padlock on the door looked new, shiny against the weathered wood. I told myself I should leave, continue on my hike, but something held me there. Maybe it was the mystery of it, or maybe just the need for some form of human connection after a day and a half alone in the woods. I circled the cabin, peering in through grimy windows. The interior was dark, but I could make out shapes of furniture, a table, some chairs. It looked lived in, not abandoned as I'd first thought. As the sun began to set, I decided to make camp nearby. I told myself it was just to rest, but deep down, I knew I was hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever used this isolated cabin. I set up my tent a little ways off, hidden in a thick stand of trees. As darkness fell, I doused my fire and settled in for the night, my ears straining for any sound. Hours passed. I was on the edge of sleep when I heard it, the low rumble of an engine. My eyes snapped open, suddenly wide awake. The sound grew louder, and then I saw headlights cutting through the trees. Heart pounding, I unzipped my tent just enough to peer out. A large pickup truck pulled into the clearing, its headlights illuminating the cabin. 3 men got out, their voices low but carrying in the still night air. "Did anyone follow you?" one asked, his tone sharp. "Nah, we're clear," another replied. "Let's get this stuff inside quick." I watched, barely breathing. As they unloaded several large duffel bags from the truck, they moved with a sense of urgency, glancing around nervously as they worked. As they opened the cabin door, light spilled out, and I caught a glimpse of what was inside one of the bags. My blood ran cold. Guns. A lot of them. I eased back into my tent, my mind racing. What had I stumbled upon? Gun runners? Drug dealers? Whatever it was, I knew I was in way over my head. I needed to leave, to get as far away from here as possible. But I was trapped. My car was miles away, and in the darkness and with these men around, trying to hike out would be suicide. So I waited, every muscle tense, listening to the muffled voices from the cabin. Occasionally, I heard laughter, the clink of bottles. They were drinking, which somehow made it all even more terrifying. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through my tent. The clearing was quiet. Cautiously, I peeked out. The truck was gone. This was my chance. I started packing up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could. Just as I was about to leave, I heard voices again, but these were different, loud, angry. "I'm telling you, someone's been here," a voice shouted. "Look at these tracks." My heart stopped. In my haste to leave, I'd been careless. They'd seen signs of my camp. "Spread out," another voice commanded. "Find them." Panic surged through me. I abandoned my tent in grabbing only my backpack. I ran, no longer caring about noise, just needing to put distance between myself and the cabin. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear them behind me, shouting to each other. They were gaining. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, tumbling down a small slope. Pain shot through my ankle as I tried to stand, sprained, maybe broken. I couldn't run. Desperately, I looked around. There, a few feet away, was a fallen tree, its roots creating a small cavity. It was my only chance. I dragged myself over, squeezing into the space. It was tight, dirt and rotting wood pressing in on all sides. I tried to control my breathing, each gasp sounding thunderous in my ears. Footsteps approached, crunching on leaves and twigs. "Where are you, you little rat?" a voice growled, terrifyingly close. I closed my eyes, willing myself to disappear. The footsteps circled my hiding spot. Once, twice. "Anything," a voice called from a distance. "Nah," the man near me replied. "Trail goes cold here. Must have doubled back." "All right. Regroup at the cabin. We need to move everything. Now." The footsteps receded. Still, I didn't move. I don't know how long I lay there, every sound making me flinch. Hours, maybe. When I finally gathered the courage to peek out, the forest was quiet. No voices, no footsteps, just the normal sounds of birds and wind in the trees. Slowly, painfully, I extracted myself from the hiding spot. My whole body ached, my ankle throbbing. But I was alive. I limped through the forest, only vaguely aware of which direction I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. As the day wore on, my pace slowed. My ankle was swollen, each step agony. The forest seemed to go on forever, trees blurring together in a green haze. Just as despair was starting to set in, I heard it. The faint sound of running water, a stream. And where there was a stream, there might be a trail. I followed the sound, hope giving me a second wind. And there it was, a small stream, and beside it, a narrow but clear trail. I wanted to cry with relief. I started down the trail, my steps a little lighter despite the pain. As I walked, I started to hear something else. Voices. But not the harsh, angry voices from before. These were light, cheerful, the sound of laughter. I rounded a bend and there they were, a family, 2 parents and a couple of kids, setting up camp by the stream. They looked up as I approached, their smiles fading to concern as they took in my appearance. "Are you all right?" the father asked, already moving towards me. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out. Instead, to my horror and embarrassment, I burst into tears. The next few hours passed in a blur. The family, the Johnsons, were on a weekend camping trip. They gave me food, water, and first aid for my ankle. Mr. Johnson used a satellite phone to call for help. As we waited for the Rangers to arrive, I told them a version of what happened, leaving out the parts about guns and being chased. I said I'd gotten lost and hurt my ankle. They were sympathetic, the kids wide-eyed at my adventure. When the Rangers finally arrived, I was taken to a small clinic in the nearest town. As a paramedic checked my ankle, a police officer came to take my statement. This time, I told the whole story: the cabin, the men, the guns, the chase. The officer's face grew increasingly serious as I spoke. "You're lucky to be alive," he said when I finished. "We've been trying to track down this group for months. They're part of a large weapons smuggling operation." He asked me more questions, writing rapidly in his notebook. When he was done, he assured me they would investigate immediately. "We'll need you to stay in town for a few days," he said, "just until we can verify everything." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. As he left, a nurse came in with some painkillers. As they started to take effect, I felt myself drifting off. In my dreams, I was back in the forest, running from unseen pursuers. But this time, there was no hiding place, no fallen tree to crawl under. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. It took me a moment to remember where I was. The small clinic room was dark, moonlight streaming through the window. I was safe. But as I lay there, listening to the quiet beep of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses in the hallway, I knew something had changed. The forest, once a place of peace and refuge, now held a darker meaning. I thought about the hike I'd planned, the solitude I'd craved. It seemed naive now, almost laughable. In seeking to escape the complexities of city life, I'd stumbled into a nightmare far worse than anything I'd left behind. As I drifted back to sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. Sometimes, the real dangers aren't in the world we're trying to escape, but in the one we're running towards. And paradise, I'd learned, can hide the darkest secrets of all. The stench of copper hit me before I even opened the door. In that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be a routine welfare check, but nothing could have prepared me for the horror that awaited inside that isolated farmhouse. My name is Sarah, and I've been a social worker for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of difficult situations: abuse, neglect, poverty. But what I encountered that day shook me to my core. It started like any other case. A concerned neighbor had called, reporting that they hadn't seen the Johnson family in days. The Johnsons were a quiet bunch: Mom, Dad, and 2 kids. They lived on a small farm about an hour outside the city, keeping to themselves mostly. It wasn't unusual for rural families to go days without seeing neighbors, but something about this call felt different. As I drove down the long, dusty road leading to the farmhouse, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. The usually picturesque countryside seemed ominous, shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. I pulled up to the house, gravel crunching under my tires. The place looked wrong. Curtains drawn tight, no sign of the usual farm activity. The old pickup truck that was always parked out front was missing. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my car. The air was thick and still, not even a breeze to rustle the overgrown grass. As I approached the porch, I noticed scratch marks on the front door, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone or something had been desperately trying to get in or out. I knocked, the sound echoing ominously. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. It's Sarah from Social Services. Just here for a check-in." No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Protocol dictated that I should leave if no one answered, but something kept me there. Call it intuition or foolishness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I tried the door handle. To my surprise, it turned easily. As the door swung open, that coppery smell hit me full force. I gagged, my hand flying to my mouth. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice shaky. "Is anyone home?" Silence greeted me, broken only by the creak of floorboards under my feet as I stepped inside. The interior of the house was dark, curtains drawn against the fading daylight. As my eyes adjusted, I saw signs of a struggle. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, a chair overturned. And then I saw the blood. It was everywhere, splattered across the walls, pooled on the hardwood floor. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. If there was any chance someone was still alive, I had to find them. I moved deeper into the house, my shoes sticking slightly to the tacky floor. The living room was a disaster, furniture overturned, picture frames smashed. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent. As I approached the kitchen, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft whimper, barely audible. It was coming from upstairs. "Hello," I called out, louder now. "Is someone there? I'm here to help." Another whimper, slightly louder this time, definitely human. I made my way to the stairs, my hand shaking as I gripped the banister. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound impossibly loud in the silent house. At the top of the stairs, I paused. The blood trail continued, leading down the hallway to a closed door at the end. The whimpering was clearer now, punctuated by soft sobs. I approached the door slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "I'm coming in," I announced, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dark, but I could make out a small figure huddled in the corner. As my eyes adjusted, I saw it was a child, a little girl, no more than 6 or 7. "Hey there," I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm despite the terror coursing through me. "My name's Sarah. I'm here to help. Are you hurt?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She was covered in blood, her blonde hair matted with it. But as I looked closer, I realized with relief that she didn't appear to be injured. The blood wasn't hers. I took a step towards her, and she flinched. "It's okay," I soothed. "I'm not going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" "Lucy," she stammered. "My name is Lucy." "Hi, Lucy," I said, kneeling down to her level. "Can you tell me what happened? Where are your parents?" At the mention of her parents, Lucy's face crumpled. She began to sob in earnest, her small body shaking. I moved closer, fighting every instinct that was telling me to grab the child and run. "It's okay, sweetie. You're safe now. Can you tell me where your parents are?" Lucy pointed a trembling finger towards the closet. My gaze followed, and I noticed for the first time that the closet door was slightly ajar. A dark liquid was seeping out from under it, spreading across the carpet. My stomach lurched. I knew what I would find, but I had to be sure. "Lucy," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it, "I need you to close your eyes for me, okay? And keep them closed until I say it's all right to open them. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, squeezing her eyes shut tight. I stood up on shaky legs and approached the closet. The smell was overwhelming now. I reached for the door handle, took a deep breath, and pulled it open. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were there, or what was left of them. Their bodies were mutilated beyond recognition. And there, huddled between them, was a little boy, Lucy's brother. His eyes were open, staring blankly. He'd been dead for days. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. I managed to close the door before I lost the contents of my stomach on the bedroom floor. As I wiped my mouth, my mind raced. What could have done this? It looked like an animal attack, but no animal I knew of could have caused this level of devastation. And how had Lucy survived? I turned back to the little girl, still huddled in the corner with her eyes squeezed shut. I needed to get her out of here now. "Lucy," I said, my voice hoarse, "you can open your eyes now. We're going to leave, okay? I'm going to take you somewhere safe." She nodded, her eyes fluttering open. I held out my hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. As we made our way downstairs, I pulled out my phone to call the police. No signal, of course. We stepped outside, the fresh air a blessed relief from the horror inside. I led Lucy to my car, helping her into the back seat. As I closed the door, I heard something that made my heart stop. A low, guttural growl. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the overgrown field beside the house. There, at the edge of the tall grass, I saw movement, something large, moving on all fours. In the fading light, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of long, sharp claws, and eyes, glowing in the twilight, fixed directly on me. I didn't think, I didn't breathe, I just moved. I yanked open the driver's door, threw myself inside, and turned the key. The engine roared to life just as the creature burst from the grass, charging towards us. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning in the gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw it gaining on us, impossibly fast. Its jaws were open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. We hit the road, and I shifted into drive, flooring the accelerator. The creature was right behind us, so close I could hear its claws scraping against the trunk. "Hold on, Lucy!" I shouted, swerving to try and shake it off. For miles, it chased us. Every time I thought we'd lost it, I'd catch a glimpse of it in the mirror, tireless, relentless. It wasn't until we hit the main road, other cars appearing around us, that it finally fell back. As we sped towards the city, lights appearing on the horizon, I allowed myself to breathe. Lucy was curled up in the back seat, silent. I glanced back at her, this tiny survivor of unimaginable horror. "It's okay," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "We're safe now." But as I drove through the night, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I knew that wasn't true. We had escaped, yes, but safety, that was an illusion that had been shattered forever. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there. And as the adrenaline faded and the reality of what I'd seen began to sink in, I realized that my life, and Lucy's, would never be the same. The quiet countryside I'd driven through just hours ago now seemed full of shadows, of hidden dangers, and I knew that from this night forward, every darkness would hold the potential for terror, every silence the promise of that bone-chilling growl. As we drove into the city, the familiar skyline offering little comfort, I made a silent vow. I would protect Lucy. I would find out what happened to her family. And somehow, someday, I would make sense of the nightmare we'd lived through. But deep down, I knew. Some horrors can't be explained. Some terrors don't end when the sun rises. And sometimes, the monsters that hide in the shadows are all too real. The day I stopped a child trafficking ring started like any other shift at the beach. But by sunset, I'd stared evil in the face and realized that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they walk among us in broad daylight. My name's Mike, and I've been a lifeguard at Sunset Beach for 5 summers now. It's usually a pretty sweet gig, sun, sand, and the occasional heroic rescue to impress the ladies. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened that scorching July afternoon. The day began normally enough. I climbed up to my perch on the lifeguard tower, slathered on sunscreen, and surveyed my domain. The beach was already packed, families staking out spots with colorful umbrellas and coolers. Kids shrieked with laughter as they splashed in the shallows, while teenagers showed off on surfboards further out. Around midday, I noticed a group of men arrive. There were 4 of them, all in their late 30s or early 40s. Something about them seemed off from the get-go. They were dressed too nicely for the beach, button-up shirts and pressed khakis instead of swim trunks and tank tops. And unlike everyone else soaking up the sun, they huddled together in the shade of a large umbrella. At first, I tried to brush off my unease. Maybe they were just some businessmen on lunch break, enjoying the view. But as the afternoon wore on, their behavior grew increasingly suspicious. They never went near the water or even took off their shoes. Instead, they sat rigid in their chairs, eyes constantly scanning the beach. Every so often, one would mutter something to the others, who'd nod gravely in response. But what really set off alarm bells was the way they watched the children. Their gazes followed kids as they ran past, lingering a bit too long. One man had a camera and seemed to be taking an awful lot of photos in the direction of the playground. Another kept checking his watch and muttering about the schedule. A chill ran down my spine despite the sweltering heat. I'd seen my fair share of creeps on the beach before, but this felt different, more organized, more sinister. I radioed my supervisor, JK, and shared my concerns. Keep an eye on them, he advised, but don't engage unless you see them actually do something. We can't accuse people without proof. I nodded, but my gut twisted with unease. What if waiting for proof meant a child disappeared? As the afternoon progressed, the men's behavior grew bolder. They split up, each taking a different section of the beach. It was like they were creating a perimeter. One positioned himself near the snack bar, another by the restrooms, while the other two lingered near the main entrances. My heart raced as I realized what they were doing. They were cutting off escape routes. I scanned the beach frantically, looking for any kids who might be in immediate danger. That's when I spotted her, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, building a sand castle near the water's edge. She was just out of her mother's line of sight, who was distracted chatting with a friend. And one of the men was walking straight toward her. Time seemed to slow down. I saw his lips move as he knelt beside her, pointing out toward the water as if showing her something. The girl smiled, nodding eagerly. He held out his hand. I didn't think. I just moved. I leaped down from my tower and sprinted across the sand, my whistle between my teeth. I blew it hard as I ran, the shrill sound cutting through the beach noise. "Hey!" I shouted as I neared them. "Step away from the child." The man's head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in anger. He dropped the girl's hand and bolted. I wanted to chase him, but the girl's safety came first. I skidded to a stop beside her as her mother came running over, alerted by my whistle. "What's going on?" she demanded, scooping up her daughter. "Ma'am, I need you to stay with your child and alert a staff member if you see that man again," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He may have been trying to abduct her. The color drained from her face as she clutched her daughter tighter. I didn't wait for a response, already scanning the beach for the other suspects. They were on the move, clearly realizing their cover was blown. I saw one making a beeline for the parking lot while another was quickly packing up their belongings. I grabbed my radio. "Jake, it's Mike. Those men I told you about, they just tried to lure a child away. I think we're dealing with traffickers. We need to lock down the beach now." Jake's response was immediate. "Copy that. I'm calling the police. Don't approach them alone, Mike. These guys could be dangerous." But I was already running toward the parking lot, determination overriding caution. I couldn't let them get away, not when children's lives were at stake. I reached the lot just as one of the men was climbing into a dark SUV. Without thinking, I grabbed a beach umbrella from a nearby stand and hurled it like a javelin. It crashed through the SUV's back window, startling the man enough that he stalled the engine. I used those precious seconds to close the distance, yanking open the driver's side door. "Out of the car!" I yelled, grabbing his arm. He swung at me, his fist connecting with my jaw. Stars exploded in my vision, but adrenaline kept me upright. I tackled him, both of us tumbling onto the asphalt. We grappled there in the parking lot, trading blows. He was stronger than I expected, but I had youth and righteous anger on my side. I managed to pin him down just as sirens wailed in the distance. "It's over," I panted, tasting blood. "The cops are coming. You're done." His eyes blazed with hatred. "You have no idea what you've done," he spat. The police arrived moments later, quickly taking control of the situation. As they cuffed the man I'd subdued, I saw 2 of his compatriots being led away in handcuffs as well. The 4th, unfortunately, had managed to escape in the chaos. The next few hours passed in a blur of questioning and statements. The police praised my quick thinking but admonished me for putting myself in danger. I barely heard them, my mind reeling as the full impact of what had almost happened sank in. These men had been methodically planning to snatch children from right under our noses. How long had they been operating? How many kids had they already taken from other beaches, other towns? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the now empty beach, a detective pulled me aside. "You did good work today, son," he said gravely. We've been trying to crack this trafficking ring for months. Thanks to you, we've finally got some solid leads. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. Those kids, I managed to ask, will they be okay? The detective's expression softened. The ones here today, yes, thanks to you. But there are others out there who still need saving. This is bigger than just one beach, I'm afraid. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked out over the darkening water, thinking of all the children who might be out there, scared and alone, and I made a decision. How can I help? I asked, turning back to the detective. I want to do more. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. We could use someone with your instincts and dedication. It won't be easy, and it's sure as hell not as glamorous as being a lifeguard. But if you're serious, come down to the station tomorrow. We'll talk. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the day's events, I knew my life had changed irrevocably. The beach I'd loved, the job I'd enjoyed, they suddenly seemed trivial in the face of the darkness I'd glimpsed. I thought of that little girl, of how close she'd come to being snatched away from everything she knew and loved. And I thought of all the other children out there who might not be as lucky. Sleep eluded me as I wrestled with the weight of my new knowledge. The world suddenly seemed a much darker, more dangerous place. But as I watched the first rays of dawn creep across my ceiling, I felt a steely resolve settle in my chest. I couldn't unsee what I'd witnessed. I couldn't unhear that man's chilling words, but I could use this experience, this anger and determination, to make a difference. As I got up to face the new day, I knew my time as a carefree lifeguard was over. A different kind of vigilance was needed now. The monsters were real, hiding in plain sight, and someone had to stand against them. Today, I'd stop being just a guardian of the beach. I'd become a guardian of innocence itself. And God help anyone who tried to harm a child on my watch again. I never thought a dusty old box would be the key to unlocking a world of danger and intrigue. But as I crouched in the shadows, listening to the voices of ruthless smugglers, I realized that some treasures are better left buried. My name is Dr. Amelia Carter, and I'm an archaeologist specializing in ancient Egyptian artifacts. I've spent years studying hieroglyphs and piecing together the mysteries of the past. But nothing in my studies could have prepared me for the heart-pounding adventure that began on a sweltering day in the Valley of the Kings. It was my third season working on a dig site near Luxor. The heat was oppressive, the sun beating down mercilessly as my team and I carefully excavated a promising area. We'd been at it for weeks, unearthing pottery shards and the occasional bit of jewelry, but nothing extraordinary. That all changed when my trowel hit something solid. "Hey guys," I called out, excitement bubbling in my voice. "I think I've found something." My colleagues gathered around as I carefully brushed away the sand. Slowly, the object began to take shape, a small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Dr. Carter, my assistant, Tom, whispered in awe, "This doesn't look like anything we've seen before." He was right. The box didn't fit with the time period we were excavating. It was older, much older, and far better preserved than it should have been. With trembling hands, I lifted the box from its resting place. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and I could hear something shifting inside. "Let's get this back to the lab," I said, cradling the box like a newborn. "We need to document everything before we open it." Back at our makeshift lab, we carefully photographed and measured the box. The hieroglyphs were unlike any I'd seen before, a mixture of known symbols and completely foreign ones. It was maddening. I could almost understand it, but crucial pieces were missing. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the desert, we finally prepared to open the box. My heart raced as I carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like silk, were several small artifacts. A golden scarab beetle, its eyes made of deep red gems, a set of small tools, their purpose unclear, and most intriguingly, a collection of papyrus scrolls. miraculously preserved. "This is incredible," I breathed, carefully unrolling one of the scrolls. The writing was crisp and clear, as if it had been penned yesterday instead of thousands of years ago. This could change everything we know about ancient Egyptian culture. We worked late into the night, cataloging and photographing each item. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally collapsed into my cot, my mind whirling with the possibilities this discovery presented. The next few days were a blur of excitement and research. We kept the find under wraps, not wanting to alert the media until we had a better understanding of what we were dealing with. But as I delved deeper into translating the scrolls, a sense of unease began to grow. The texts spoke of hidden temples, of rituals and powers that defied explanation, and more worryingly, of a group dedicated to protecting these secrets at all costs. It was on the fifth night after our discovery that things took a dark turn. I was working late in the lab, poring over one of the scrolls, when I heard voices outside, angry voices, speaking in hushed tones. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the window, peeking out from behind the curtain. What I saw made my blood run cold. Two men, dressed in dark clothes, were arguing with one of our local workers. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their body language was clear. They were threatening him. I watched, heart pounding, as they pressed something into the worker's hand. Money, I assumed, and then melted back into the shadows. Sleep eluded me that night. Who were those men? What did they want? A part of me hoped it was unrelated to our discovery, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I pulled Tom aside. "We need to be careful," I told him, recounting what I'd seen. I think someone might be after the artifacts." Tom's face paled. "Wow, what do we do? Should we tell the authorities?" I shook my head. "Not yet. We don't know who we can trust. For now, let's just keep everything under tight security. Don't let anyone near the artifacts unless I'm present." But despite our precautions, the atmosphere at the dig site changed. I felt eyes on me constantly. Whispered conversations would stop abruptly when I approached. And then, items started to go missing. Small things at first. A notebook here, a tool there. But it was enough to set me on edge. It all came to a head a week later. I was working late again, trying to decipher a particularly tricky passage in one of the scrolls. The lab was quiet, everyone else having retired for the night. A noise outside made me jump. Footsteps, trying to be quiet but failing in the stillness of the night. I quickly turned off my lamp and ducked behind a large crate, my heart thundering in my chest. The door creaked open. Two figures slipped inside, their faces obscured by the darkness. They moved with purpose, heading straight for the safe where we kept the artifacts. "Hurry up," one of them hissed. "We need to get this done before anyone notices." I watched in horror as they expertly cracked the safe, pulling out the box and its precious contents. They worked quickly, transferring everything into a backpack. I must have made a noise, a gasp, a shifting of my weight. Because suddenly, one of them whirled around, peering into the darkness where I hid. "Someone's here," he growled. I didn't wait. I bolted, knocking over equipment in my haste to get to the door. Behind me, I heard shouts and the sound of pursuit. I ran into the night, the cool desert air whipping past me. I had no plan, no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to get away, to protect the knowledge we'd uncovered. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear kept me going. Eventually, I found myself in a small copse of trees, an oasis in the desert. Collapsing behind a large rock, I tried to catch my breath and think. What could I do? Who could I trust? As if in answer to my unspoken questions, I heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. Peering out from my hiding spot, I saw a Jeep pull up. Tom jumped out, looking frantic. "Dr. Carter," he called out. "Are you here? It's me, Tom. You're in danger." Relief flooded through me. I stumbled out from behind the rock. Tom, thank God. They took the artifacts. We need to... My words died in my throat. Behind Tom, emerging from the Jeep, were the two men I'd seen in the lab. Tom's face fell. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Carter," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "They have my family. I didn't have a choice." I backed away, my mind reeling with betrayal, but there was nowhere to run. The men approached, their expressions grim. "Dr. Carter," one of them said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "we don't want to hurt you, but you've stumbled onto something bigger than you can imagine, something that needs to stay hidden." "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "We're keepers of an ancient secret," the other man replied. "The artifacts you found, they're part of something dangerous, something that could upset the balance of the world if it fell into the wrong hands." I wanted to laugh. It sounded absurd, like something out of a movie. But the gravity in their eyes, the way Tom wouldn't meet my gaze, it made a horrifying kind of sense. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The first man sighed. "Now, you have a choice. You can come with us, learn the truth about what you've discovered, help us protect it, or..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. I looked at Tom, at the artifacts peeking out of the backpack, at the vast desert around us. In that moment, I realized that the quiet life I'd known, the simple pursuit of knowledge, it was over. I took a deep breath. "I'll come with you," I said, "but I want answers, all of them." The men nodded, relief evident on their faces. As they led me to the Jeep, I cast one last look at the dig site in the distance, the place where my old life had ended, and a new, dangerous chapter had begun. As we drove off into the night, the box of artifacts secure between us, I couldn't help but wonder. In uncovering the secrets of the past, had I sealed my own fate? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The dusty world of archaeology would never be the same for me again. I always thought I was a good judge of character. But on that rainy night, as the stranger in my passenger seat revealed his true nature, I realized how deadly wrong I could be. My name's Sarah, and I've been driving for a rideshare company for about a year now. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and lets me meet all sorts of interesting people. At least, that's what I used to think before that fateful night. It was a Friday evening in late October, the kind of night where the rain comes down in sheets, turning the world into a blur of neon reflections and headlights. I'd been driving for hours, ferrying drunk college kids and weary office workers through the slick streets of downtown. I was just about to call it quits when my phone pinged with one last ride request. The pickup location was on the outskirts of town, near an old industrial park. Not the safest area, but the surge pricing was too good to pass up. Besides, I told myself, what were the odds of something bad happening on my very last ride? As I pulled up to the address, I saw a lone figure standing under a flickering streetlight. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. A small duffel bag was slung over his shoulder. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to drive away. But then I remembered all the times I'd been judged unfairly based on my appearance. Who was I to do the same to this guy? I unlocked the doors and he slid into the back seat, bringing with him the smell of rain and something else I couldn't quite place. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Not many people would pick up a guy like me in this part of town. I forced a smile, meeting his eyes in the rearview mirror. They were dark and intense, sending a shiver down my spine. "No problem," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where to?" He gave me an address about an hour outside of town. It was way out of my usual area, but the fare would be substantial. I punched it into my GPS and pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes, we drove in silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the patter of rain on the roof. I tried to focus on the road, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. "So," I said, desperate to break the tension, "what brings you out to the middle of nowhere on a night like this?" He was quiet for so long, I thought he hadn't heard me. When he finally spoke, his words sent ice through my veins. "I'm running from something," he said. "Something bad." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Oh," I managed to squeak out. "Like what?" He leaned forward, his breath hot on my ear. "The police," he whispered. "And I've done something terrible, and they're after me." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked, What did you do?" He sat back, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Why don't you pull over and I'll show you?" Every instinct I had was screaming at me to floor it, to get as far away from this man as possible. But we were on a deserted stretch of highway, trees looming on either side. There was nowhere to go. I don't think that's a good idea," I stammered. "Maybe I should just take you to your destination." His hand shot out, gripping my shoulder with surprising strength. "Pull over. Now." I did as he said, easing the car onto the muddy shoulder. As soon as we stopped, he was out of the car, moving around to my door. I fumbled with the lock, but he was faster, yanking the door open and dragging me out into the rain. I stumbled, falling to my knees in the mud. When I looked up, he was standing over me, a wicked-looking knife glinting in his hand. "Please," I begged, rain and tears mingling on my face. "You don't have to do this." He crouched down, bringing the knife close to my cheek. "Oh, but I do," he said, almost tenderly. "You see, I can't have any witnesses. And you, my dear, have seen far too much." I closed my eyes, waiting for the bite of the blade. But instead, I heard a sound that made my eyes fly open in shock. Laughter. The man was laughing, deep belly laughs that shook his whole body. And then, to my utter disbelief, he helped me to my feet. "Oh, man," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "You should see your face right now, priceless." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what was happening. What's going on?" He grinned, all traces of menace gone from his face. "It's a prank, sweetheart. For my YouTube channel. See?" He pointed to a small camera attached to his hoodie. "You've been punked." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by anger. "Are you kidding me?" I shouted, shoving him hard. "You scared me half to death. What is wrong with you?" His grin faltered. "Hey, come on. It's just a joke. People love this stuff online." I was about to lay into him further when a new sound cut through the night. Sirens, growing closer by the second. The man's face drained of color. "Shit," he muttered. "Someone must have seen us and called the cops. We gotta go." But I stood my ground. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere with you. You can explain your little prank to the police yourself." His expression hardened. "I'm not asking," he growled, grabbing my arm. The menace was back in his voice, and this time, I knew it wasn't an act. I struggled against his grip, but he was too strong. He started dragging me back towards the car, his fingers digging painfully into my arm. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I remembered the self-defense class I'd taken years ago, the instructor's voice ringing in my ears. "Use whatever you have as a weapon." My free hand closed around the car keys in my pocket. In one swift motion, I whipped them out and raked them across his face. He howled in pain, releasing my arm to clutch at his bleeding cheek. I didn't hesitate. I ran, sprinting down the highway towards the approaching sirens. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the wet asphalt, but fear and adrenaline propelled me forward, faster than I'd ever run in my life. The police car came into view, its lights cutting through the rain. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The car screeched to a halt, and two officers jumped out, guns drawn. "Get down!" one of them shouted. I dropped to the ground, my heart racing. I heard a scuffle behind me, then the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. As the officers helped me to my feet, I turned to see my attacker being shoved into the back of the police car. The look he gave me was one of pure hatred. "Are you all right, ma'am?" one of the officers asked, draping a blanket over my shoulders. I nodded, my whole body shaking with delayed shock. I think so, thank you." Over the next few hours, I gave my statement to the police. It turned out the man, whose real name was Derek, had a history of similar pranks that had escalated to actual assaults. The duffel bag in my car contained rope, duct tape, and other items that made it clear his intentions were far from innocent. As I sat in the police station, sipping lukewarm coffee and trying to process everything that had happened, a detective approached me. "Ms. Johnson," he said gently, "I know this has been a traumatic experience, but I want you to know that you likely saved lives tonight. We've been tracking this guy for months, but he always managed to stay one step ahead. Thanks to you, he's finally off the streets." His words should have made me feel better, but all I felt was numb. The realization of how close I'd come to becoming another statistic, another tragic headline, was overwhelming. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to return to normal life. Every time I got behind the wheel, I found myself checking and rechecking the locks. Every passenger became a potential threat. But slowly, with the help of therapy and the support of my friends and family, I began to heal. I learned that trusting my instincts wasn't the same as judging people unfairly, that it was okay to prioritize my safety over being polite. I never drove for the rideshare company again. Instead, I channeled my experience into advocating for stronger safety measures for drivers and passengers alike. I shared my story, hoping to help others trust their gut and stay safe. That rainy night changed me forever. But it also showed me a strength I never knew I had, and while I'll always be more cautious now, I refuse to let fear rule my life. After all, for every Derek in the world, there are countless good people, and that's a truth worth remembering, even on the darkest, rainiest nights. The night I discovered a criminal operation in the warehouse was the night I realized that sometimes the most dangerous secrets hide in the most mundane places. What started as a routine shift turned into a fight for survival that would change my life forever. My name's Jack, and I've been working night security at the Millennium Storage Warehouse for about 3 years now. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays the bills and gives me plenty of time to work on my novel. At least, that's what I used to think before that fateful night. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of night where the wind howls around the corners of the building and every shadow seems to move. I'd just started my shift, settling into the small security office with a thermos of coffee and my dog-eared notebook. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made my rounds, checking the locks and peering down the long aisles of crates and boxes. The warehouse was huge, a maze of steel shelving units stretching up to the ceiling. Most of the time, I found the solitude peaceful, but tonight, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the wind was making the metal roof creak and groan, or maybe it was just that my imagination was working overtime after spending the day writing a particularly tense chapter of my crime novel. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it, a faint sound, almost lost in the ambient noise of the building. But years of working nights had sharpened my hearing, and I knew it didn't belong. I muted the small TV in the security office and listened hard. There it was again, a metallic clinking sound, followed by muffled voices. It was coming from the north section of the warehouse, an area that was supposed to be empty. My heart started to race. This wasn't like the other times I'd investigated strange noises, only to find a raccoon had gotten in or a stack of boxes had fallen over. This was different. This was human. I reached for my radio to call for backup, but as I keyed the mic, I realized I was out of range. The north section was the farthest point from the security office, and the signal couldn't penetrate the maze of metal shelving. I had a choice to make. I could go back to the office and call the police, potentially letting whoever was in here get away. Or I could investigate myself and gather evidence. Looking back, I know I should have called the cops. But in that moment, fueled by adrenaline and maybe a little too much confidence from writing about fictional heroics, I decided to check it out myself. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way towards the north section, moving as quietly as I could. The voices grew louder as I approached, and I could make out snatches of conversation. "Hurry up, we don't have all night," one voice hissed. "I'm going as fast as I can," another replied. "This stuff is heavy." I crept closer, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. As I rounded a corner, I saw them. 5 men, all dressed in dark clothing, loading crates onto a forklift. I recognized one of the crates. It had come in last week, marked as electronic components and for a local tech company. But as I watched, one of the men pried it open, revealing rows of weapons inside. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a simple burglary. This was something much bigger, much more dangerous. I must have gasped or made some small noise, because suddenly one of the men looked up. Our eyes met, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. Then all hell broke loose. "We've got company," the man shouted, reaching for something at his waist. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, my feet pounding on the concrete floor. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. I weaved through the aisles, trying to lose them in the labyrinth of shelves. But they knew the layout too well. Every turn I took, it seemed like one of them was there, cutting off my escape. I found myself cornered in a dead-end aisle, the sounds of footsteps closing in from both sides. Desperate, I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon or a hiding place. That's when I saw it, a small gap between 2 massive crates, just big enough for me to squeeze through. Without hesitation, I dove in, scraping my arms and legs on the rough wood. I held my breath as the men ran past my hiding spot, their flashlight beams sweeping the area. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I heard one of them say, "Check every nook and cranny." He couldn't have gone far. I knew it was only a matter of time before they found me. I needed a plan, and fast. As quietly as I could, I fished my cell phone out of my pocket. No signal. Of course. I was about to give up hope when I remembered the emergency call feature. Even without a signal, I might be able to reach 911. With shaking fingers, I dialed the number and pressed the phone to my ear. The seconds it took to connect felt like an eternity. 911. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. In a whisper, I quickly explained the situation. "I'm at Millennium Storage Warehouse. There are armed men here, smuggling weapons. I'm hiding, but they're looking for me. Please hurry." "Sir, stay calm. We're dispatching units to your location now. Can you stay on the line?" Before I could answer, a hand grabbed my ankle and yanked me out of my hiding spot. My phone clattered to the ground, the operator's voice still faintly audible. I found myself face to face with one of the men, his eyes cold and angry behind a ski mask. "Thought you could hide from us, rent-a-cop," he sneered. I was hauled to my feet and dragged back to where the others were waiting. My arms were roughly tied behind my back, and I was shoved to my knees. "What do we do with him?" one of the men asked. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, looked at me thoughtfully. "We can't leave any witnesses," he said finally. "Take care of him, then we'll finish loading and get out of here." My heart sank. This was it. I was going to die here, in this warehouse. All because I'd been too curious and too stupid to call for backup right away. As one of the men raised a gun, I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of a gunshot, I heard the most welcome sound in the world. Police sirens, growing louder by the second. The warehouse erupted into chaos. The men scattered, dropping their weapons and running for the exits. I heard shouts of, "Police! Freeze!" and the sound of footsteps thundering all around me. When I opened my eyes, I was surrounded by officers. One of them was cutting the ties on my wrists, asking if I was okay. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions and statements. The police had caught most of the men, though a couple had managed to escape. They uncovered a massive weapons smuggling operation, one that had been running right under my nose for months. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows through the warehouse windows, a detective approached me. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I want you to know that your actions tonight have probably saved countless lives. The weapons we've seized here, well, let's just say they would have done a lot of damage in the wrong hands." I nodded, still in shock from the night's events. "I was just doing my job," I mumbled. The detective smiled. "You did a lot more than that. You showed real courage. Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement?" I laughed weakly. "I think I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. Thanks." But as I watched the police continue to process the scene, I felt something shift inside me. The fear and adrenaline were fading, replaced by a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. I realized that my nights of quiet security shifts and writing fiction were over. I'd glimpsed a world of real danger and real heroism, and I couldn't go back to pretending. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking more and more about the detective's words. Maybe I did have what it took to make a difference in the real world, not just on the pages of my novel. 6 months later, I enrolled in the police academy. It wasn't an easy decision, and the training was brutal. But every time I doubted myself, I remembered that night in the warehouse. I remembered the courage I'd found when it mattered most. Now, as I patrol the streets in my police cruiser, I sometimes think back to my old job at the warehouse. I think about how one ordinary night changed the course of my life forever, and I realize that sometimes the greatest adventures and the greatest dangers are hiding in the most unexpected places. All it takes is the courage to investigate that strange noise in the night, and the wisdom to know when to call for backup. I never thought a cheap motel room would become my own personal hell, but as I huddled in the bathroom, listening to the sound of someone picking the lock, I realized that sometimes the most dangerous predators hide behind the friendliest smiles. "My name's Mike, and I'm a traveling salesman." Yeah, I know. It sounds like the setup for a bad joke. But it's my life. Driving from town to town, staying in one dingy motel after another. You get used to it after a while. Or at least, I thought I had. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I pulled into the parking lot of the Starlight Motel. The neon sign flickered weakly, half the bulbs burnt out. But it was cheap, and I was tired after a long day of rejections and slammed doors. The guy at the front desk looked like he'd been there since the motel opened, probably sometime in the 70s. He had that overly friendly demeanor that always puts me on edge, asking too many questions as he checked me in. "So, what brings you to our little town, Mr. Johnson?" he asked, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Just passing through," I replied, trying to keep it vague. "Got some business in the next county over." He nodded, a little too enthusiastically. Of course. Lot of salesmen come through here. Always on the move, aren't you? Must be lonely." I forced a laugh, eager to get to my room and away from his probing questions. Why, yet it has its moments. But hey, that's the job. He handed me the key, an actual metal key, not one of those electronic cards. "Well, you enjoy your stay now. If you need anything at all, just let old Bob know." I thanked him and headed to my room, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling his attention had given me. The room was about what you'd expect: musty smell, faded wallpaper, a TV that had seen better days. But the bed looked clean enough, and that was all I really cared about. I dropped my bags and flopped onto the bed, not even bothering to take off my shoes. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a knock at the door. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to answer it. Bob stood there, that same too-wide smile on his face. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Johnson," he said, not sounding sorry at all. Just wanted to check if everything was all right. Noticed your car had a flat tire. I blinked, confusion giving way to alarm. What? But I just drove in. How could... Oh, these things happen. He cut me off smoothly. Tell you what, why don't you come take a look? I'm pretty handy with cars, might be able to help you out. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to go with him, but I was still half asleep, and the thought of being stranded with a flat tire in the morning was enough to override my caution. Sure, I said, grabbing my jacket. Lead the way. We walked out to the parking lot, the night air chilly against my face. As we approached my car, I noticed something odd. All the tires looked fine. I turned to Bob, my mouth open to question him, when I saw the glint of metal in his hand. Before I could react, something hard connected with the side of my head. The world spun, then went black. I came to slowly, my head pounding. As my vision cleared, I realized I was back in my motel room, tied to a chair. Bob stood in front of me, that friendly smile now twisted into something sinister. Well, he chuckled. Sleeping Beauty awakes. You know, Mr. Johnson, you salesmen are all the same. So trusting, so easy to lure. Fear clawed at my throat as the reality of my situation sank in. What do you want from me? Bob's eyes glittered with a mix of greed and madness. Oh, it's not about what I want. It's about what you have. You see, salesmen always carry cash, always have something valuable in those fancy little sample cases of yours. He moved to my bags, rifling through them with practiced ease. But that's not all, he continued, almost conversationally. You're also perfect victims, always on the move. No one misses you for days, sometimes weeks. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications of his words. How many others had fallen into this trap? How many lives had ended in this very room? As Bob continued to search my belongings, I tested my bonds. The ropes were tight, but there was a slight give in the one around my right wrist. If I could just... Don't bother, Bob said, not even turning around. I've done this enough times to know how to tie a knot. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I needed to think, to find a way out of this. Listen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You don't have to do this. I won't tell anyone. Just take my money and let me go. Bob turned to me, shaking his head with mock sadness. Now, you know I can't do that. Can't have you running to the cops, can I? No. I'm afraid this is where your journey ends, Mr. Johnson. He pulled out a wicked-looking knife, the blade catching the dim light. But don't worry, I'll make it quick. I'm not a monster after all. As he approached me, knife raised, something in me snapped. With strength born of desperation, I threw myself backwards, chair and all. I crashed to the floor, the impact sending shock waves of pain through my body. But it also loosened the ropes just enough. Bob lunged at me, but I managed to roll away, my right hand now free. I grabbed the nearest object, a table lamp, and swung it with all my might. It connected with Bob's head with a sickening crunch, and he went down hard. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath, then moving as quickly as I could with my limbs still partially bound, I worked to free myself completely. Once loose, I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my wallet and car keys, not bothering with the rest of my belongings. As I ran for the door, I heard Bob groan. He was starting to come around. I burst out of the room and sprinted for my car, fumbling with the keys. Behind me, I could hear Bob shouting, his footsteps pounding on the pavement. I threw myself into the driver's seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and peeled out of the parking lot in a spray of gravel. In my rearview mirror, I saw Bob standing in the middle of the road, his face a mask of rage. I drove for hours, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, expecting at any moment to see headlights gaining on me. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I pulled into a busy truck stop, my mind racing. I needed to call the police, but a part of me was terrified they wouldn't believe me. What if Bob had friends in law enforcement, What if this was all part of some bigger operation? In the end, I decided to keep driving. I crossed state lines, only stopping when absolutely necessary. It wasn't until I was 3 states away that I finally worked up the courage to go to the police. The detective who took my statement listened with a grim expression. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said when I finished. "We've had similar stories from other travelers. But you're the first to get away and be able to identify the perpetrator." Over the next few weeks, I worked with the police, helping them build a case against Bob and the Starlight Motel. It turned out I was right. It was part of a larger operation. Bob was just one cog in a machine that had been preying on travelers for years. When they finally made the arrests, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. The experience had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I couldn't go back to my old job. The thought of driving from town to town, staying in motels, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. Instead, I found a local sales position, one that let me go home to my own bed every night. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I think about how close I came to becoming just another missing person, another unsolved mystery. I think about the others who weren't as lucky as me, whose stories ended in that dingy motel room. And I realize that the world is full of Bobs, predators hiding behind friendly smiles and helpful gestures. It's a knowledge that weighs heavy on me, but it's also made me more aware, more cautious. Now, when I check into a hotel or meet a stranger, I'm always on guard. Some might call it paranoia, but I know better, because sometimes the most dangerous threats aren't the ones that look scary on the surface. Sometimes, they're the ones that lure you in with a smile and a, "How can I help you today?" In the end, I learned that trust is a precious thing, not to be given away lightly, and that sometimes the difference between life and death can be as simple as listening to that little voice inside that says, "Something's not right here." I survived my night at the Starlight Motel, but the real challenge has been learning to live with the knowledge of what lurks behind some of the friendliest facades. It's a lesson I'll never forget, and one I hope others can learn without having to go through what I did. Because in this world, a little caution can go a long way. And sometimes, the most important skill isn't in making the sale. It's in recognizing when you're the one being sold a deadly lie. The day I found the first hidden camera was the day my world shattered. But it wasn't until the mysterious messages started appearing on my TV that I realized the true depths of the nightmare I was living in. My name is Olivia, and until 3 months ago, I was just a normal 28-year-old photographer living in a cozy loft apartment in downtown Chicago. I loved my space, the exposed brick walls, the huge windows that let in the perfect natural light for my work, the sense of safety and solitude in the heart of the bustling city. It all started innocently enough. I was cleaning my bathroom, reaching behind the toilet to grab a stray piece of trash, when my hand brushed against something small and hard stuck to the back of the tank. Curious, I pulled it off and examined it. It was a tiny black device, no bigger than a button, with a lens on one side. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was holding. A camera, a hidden camera in my bathroom. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was left over from the previous tenant. But as I searched my apartment with growing panic, I found more. One hidden in a potted plant in my bedroom, another disguised as a screw in my kitchen light fixture. Each discovery sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I called the police, of course. They came, took my statement, collected the cameras as evidence. They were sympathetic but not particularly helpful. "I unfortunately, miss. This kind of thing is becoming more common," the officer told me. "We'll investigate, but without any leads." I knew what he wasn't saying. They probably wouldn't find who did this. I was on my own. The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I had a security company come in and sweep my entire apartment. They found 3 more cameras I had missed. I changed all my locks, installed a state-of-the-art security system, even put privacy film on all my windows. But it wasn't enough. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I entered a room, my eyes would dart to the corners, searching for that telltale glint of a lens. I stopped inviting friends over, too ashamed and scared to explain why I jumped at every sound, why I insisted on whispering even in my own home. Then, about a month after finding the first camera, it happened. I was up late editing photos when my TV suddenly turned on by itself. The screen was black, but white text began to appear, as if someone was typing in real time. "Hello, Olivia. Did you really think you could keep me out?" I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. But it was real. All too real. More text appeared. "I see you, Olivia. I've always seen you, and I always will." I yanked the TV's plug from the wall, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. But even with the TV dark and silent, I could feel eyes on me, watching, always watching. That night, I slept in my car, parked in a busy 24-hour grocery store lot. The next day, I went to the police again. They took another report, promised to look into it, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Without proof, without the message still on my TV, it was just the word of an increasingly paranoid woman. I tried to go about my life as normally as possible. I had photo shoots to complete, clients to meet, but the feeling of being surveilled never left me. I started noticing strange things. My furniture slightly out of place when I came home, as if someone had been in my apartment. My computer files accessed when I knew I hadn't opened them, and the messages kept coming. Sometimes on my TV, sometimes on my computer. Always taunting, always reminding me that I was being watched. "That red blouse looks lovely on you, Olivia, but I prefer you in blue. You really shouldn't eat so late at night. It's bad for your digestion. Your mother seemed worried when you talked to her today. Maybe you should visit her soon." Each message was a knife twisting in my gut, a reminder that every aspect of my life was under surveillance. I stopped using my computer except for absolute necessities. I covered my TV with a blanket. I even started changing clothes in my closet, the only space in my apartment without any corners for cameras to hide. Friends started to notice something was wrong. I had lost weight, dark circles permanently etched under my eyes from lack of sleep. But how could I explain? How could I tell them that my entire life had become a real-life horror movie? 2 months in, I reached my breaking point. A message appeared on my phone, a device I thought was safe, that I had checked and rechecked for spyware. "You can't hide from me, Olivia. I'm always with you. Always." Something in me snapped. I threw my phone against the wall, watching with a mix of satisfaction and despair as it shattered into pieces. Then I started on the rest of my apartment. I tore down curtains, ripped up floorboards, smashed holes in my walls. If there were any cameras left, I was going to find them. Hours later, my beautiful loft was in shambles. Dust and debris covered everything. My hands were bleeding from tearing through wood and plaster, and I hadn't found a single camera. As I stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of my life, a horrible realization began to dawn on me. What if there were no more cameras? What if this was all in my head? The thought was almost worse than the reality of being watched, because if I was imagining this, if my mind was turning against me, how could I ever feel safe again? I sank to the floor, sobs racking my body. I don't know how long I sat there, crying in the ruins of my home. But eventually, a calm settled over me, a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. I stood up, wiped my eyes, and began to clean. As I worked, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. Whether the threat was real or imagined, I needed help. The next day, I checked myself into a psychiatric hospital. I told them everything, about the cameras, the messages, the constant feeling of being watched. The doctors listened without judgment, promised to help me unravel what was real and what might be a product of trauma and stress. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. The hospital room was sparse, institutional, but it felt safer than my apartment had in a long time. It's been 3 weeks since I admitted myself. The doctors have diagnosed me with a mix of PTSD and paranoid delusions, triggered by the very real trauma of finding those initial cameras. We're working through it with a combination of therapy and medication. Some days are harder than others. There are times I still feel watched, still want to check every corner for hidden lenses. But I'm learning to challenge those thoughts, to ground myself in reality. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again. I don't know if I'll ever uncover the full truth about who planted those first cameras, or if the messages were real or a product of my fractured psyche. But I'm taking it one day at a time. I'm not sure what the future holds. My apartment is still in shambles, my photography business on hold. But for the first time in months, I feel a glimmer of hope. I'm reclaiming my life, piece by piece. And the most important lesson I've learned: sometimes the biggest threats aren't external. Sometimes the most dangerous traps are the ones our minds create for us. But with help, with perseverance, we can find our way out of even the darkest labyrinths. As I sit here in my hospital room, looking out at the city skyline, I make a promise to myself. I will not let fear rule my life. I will not let unseen watchers, real or imagined, steal my peace. I will rebuild, I will recover, and I will reclaim my sense of safety. Because in the end, the most important gaze to be concerned with is our own, the way we see ourselves, and the strength we find within to face our deepest fears. I never thought accepting a ride request would lead me straight into a nightmare. But as the cold barrel of a gun pressed against my neck, I realized that sometimes the most dangerous journeys begin with a simple, "Where to?" My name's Alex, and I've been driving for a popular rideshare company for about a year now. It's not glamorous work, but it helps pay the bills while I finish my degree. Most nights are pretty uneventful: drunk college kids, tired office workers, the occasional tourist. But nothing could have prepared me for that rainy Friday night. It was just past midnight, and I was considering calling it quits when one last ride request popped up on my phone. The surge pricing was too good to pass up, so I accepted and headed to the pickup location, a dimly lit street corner in a part of town I didn't know well. As I pulled up, I saw a man standing under a flickering street light. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. Something about him set my nerves on edge, but I brushed it off. I'd learned not to judge passengers by their appearance. He slid into the back seat, bringing with him the smell of rain and cigarettes. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not many drivers come to this neighborhood." I forced a smile, meeting his eyes in the rearview mirror. They were dark and intense, sending a shiver down my spine. "No problem," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where to?" He gave me an address about an hour outside of town. It was way out of my usual area, but the fare would be substantial. I punched it into my GPS and pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes, we drove in silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the patter of rain on the roof. I tried to focus on the road, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. "So," I said, desperate to break the tension, "what brings you out to the middle of nowhere on a night like this?" He was quiet for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. When he finally spoke, his words sent ice through my veins. "I'm running from something," he said. "Something bad." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Oh," I managed to squeak out. "Like what?" He leaned forward, his breath hot on my ear. "The police," he whispered. "I've done something terrible, and they're after me." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked, What did you do?" He sat back, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Why don't you pull over and I'll show you?" Every instinct I had was screaming at me to floor it. to get as far away from this man as possible. But we were on a deserted stretch of highway, trees looming on either side. There was nowhere to go. I don't think that's a good idea, I stammered. Maybe I should just take you to your destination. His hand shot out, gripping my shoulder with surprising strength. Pull. Over. Now. I did as he said, easing the car onto the muddy shoulder. As soon as we stopped, I felt something cold and hard press against the back of my neck. I didn't need to look to know it was a gun. Now, he said, his voice eerily calm. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get out of the car nice and slow. Then you're going to get in the back seat. I'm driving now. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But with a gun to my head, my options were limited. Slowly, I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the rain. As I moved to the back seat, I caught a glimpse of his face in the glow of the dome light. His eyes were wild, pupils dilated. Whatever he was running from, whatever he had done, I knew I was in serious danger. He slid into the driver's seat, keeping the gun trained on me. Phone, he barked. I handed it over, watching as he rolled down the window and tossed it into the darkness. As we pulled back onto the highway, I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. Listen, I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. You don't have to do this. I won't tell anyone, I swear. Just let me go. He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. It's too late for that. You're in this now, whether you like it or not. For the next hour, we drove in tense silence. I watched the familiar landscape give way to rolling hills and dense forests. We were heading into the mountains, far from any help. Finally, he turned onto a narrow dirt road, barely visible in the gloom. The car bounced and swayed as we climbed higher, deeper into the wilderness. We came to a stop in front of a small, run-down cabin. Out, he ordered, gesturing with the gun. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A table, a couple of chairs, a small kitchenette. He motioned for me to sit, then began pacing, muttering to himself. What are you going to do with me? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. He stopped pacing, fixing me with those intense eyes. I haven't decided yet, he said. Depends on how cooperative you are. Hours passed. He alternated between manic energy, ranting about conspiracies and people out to get him, and eerie calm. I tried to engage him, to build some kind of rapport, but he was unpredictable. One moment he'd be almost friendly, the next he'd be pressing the gun to my temple, accusing me of working with them. As dawn broke, painting the cabin in pale light, I heard a sound that made my heart leap. Sirens, faint but growing louder. My captor heard it too, his face contorted with rage. You! He screamed. You led them here somehow. I shook my head frantically. No, I swear, how could I? You took my phone, remember? But he wasn't listening. He grabbed me roughly, dragging me to my feet. We're leaving. Now. He shoved me toward the door, the gun pressed painfully into my back. But as we stepped outside, I saw salvation, a line of police cars coming up the dirt road, lights flashing. What happened next was a blur. My captor yelled something, pushing me in front of him like a shield. I heard shouts from the police, ordering him to drop the weapon. Then a deafening crack, and I was falling. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. For a moment, I thought I'd been shot. But as I gasped for air, I realized I was unharmed. My captor lay a few feet away, blood pooling beneath him. The next few hours passed in a haze of paramedics, police questions, and shock blankets. I learned that the man, whose real name was Eric Daniels, was wanted for a string of violent crimes across 3 states. My disappearance had triggered a massive manhunt, leading the police right to his hideout. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, watching the sun rise over the mountains, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. I had stared death in the face and survived. But at what cost? In the weeks that followed, I struggled to return to normal life. Every car that pulled up beside me at a stoplight made my heart race. Every ping from my phone sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't bring myself to drive for the rideshare company again, or to drive at all, and for that matter. But slowly, with the help of therapy and the support of my friends and family, I began to heal. I learned that survival itself is a victory. That strength isn't about not being afraid, but about facing that fear and moving forward anyway. I still have nightmares sometimes, still flinch at unexpected noises, but I'm reclaiming my life, piece by piece. I've started volunteering at a local crisis center, using my experience to help others who have faced trauma. And on the anniversary of that terrifying night, I did something I never thought I'd do again. I got behind the wheel of a car. I drove up into those same mountains, not to relive the horror, but to remind myself of how far I've come. As I stood there, looking out over the vast wilderness that had once been my prison, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The road ahead might be long and sometimes frightening, but I know now that I have the strength to face whatever comes my way. Because sometimes, the most important journey isn't the one that takes us to a physical destination. It's the one that leads us back to ourselves, stronger and more resilient than ever before. I never thought my love for solitude would lead me into the clutches of a madman. But as I huddled in my van, listening to the stranger's footsteps circling outside, I realized that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we invite in. My name's Sarah, and I've been living the van life for about 2 years now. After a messy divorce and a soul-crushing corporate job, I decided to pack it all in and hit the road. My converted Sprinter van became my home, office, and sanctuary. I loved the freedom, the connection with nature, and yes, the solitude. That fateful night, I was parked in a secluded spot in the Ozarks. It was a beautiful area I'd discovered a few days earlier, a clearing near a small lake, far from any main roads or campgrounds, the kind of place only locals or very adventurous travelers would know about. I'd spent the day hiking and was looking forward to a quiet evening of reading and stargazing. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I settled into my camp chair with a book and a glass of wine. The peace was shattered by the sound of an engine struggling up the dirt road. Headlights cut through the trees, and a beat-up pickup truck lurched into the clearing. My heart sank. So much for solitude. But as the driver got out, stumbling slightly, I felt a twinge of concern. He was a tall, thin man with wild, unkempt hair. Even from a distance, I could see he looked rough. "Hello," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Is anyone there? I need help." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay quiet, to pretend I wasn't there. But what if he was really in trouble? "Over here," I replied, standing up. "Are you okay?" He turned towards me, relief visible on his face even in the fading light. "Oh, thank God," he said, limping towards me. "My truck broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for hours. Do you have a phone I could use?" As he got closer, I could see he was younger than I first thought, maybe early 30s. His clothes were dirty and torn, and there was a wild look in his eyes that made me uneasy. "I'm sorry," I said, taking a step back. "I don't have any cell service out here." He nodded, looking dejected. "Yeah, figures. This whole area's a dead zone." He glanced at my van, then back at me with a hopeful expression. "Listen, I hate to ask, but is there any chance you could give me a ride into town tomorrow? I can sleep in my truck tonight, but I really need to get it towed in the morning." I bit my lip, conflicted. On one hand, I wanted to help. On the other, the thought of letting this stranger into my van, my home, filled me with dread. "I don't know," I said slowly. "I'm not really heading that way." "Please," he interrupted, his voice cracking. "I don't know what else to do. I'm not in a good place right now. I just need a little help." Something in his tone, the raw desperation, got to me. Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. "Okay," I said. "I can't take you all the way into town, but I can drop you at the ranger station about 20 miles from here in the morning. They'll be able to help you with your truck." The relief on his face was palpable. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you so much. I'm Jacob, by the way." "Sarah," I replied, still keeping my distance. "Listen, Jake, I have a small tent you can use for the night. I'll set it up for you." He looked at the van, then back at me with a frown. "It's supposed to rain tonight. Couldn't I just sleep in your van? I promise I'll be a perfect gentleman." Alarm bells went off in my head. "I'm sorry, but no. The van is my home. The tent is the best I can offer." For a moment, I thought I saw a flash of anger in his eyes, but it was gone so quickly I convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Of course," he said, forcing a smile. "The tent would be great. Thank you." I set up the tent for him a good distance from my van, handed him a sleeping bag and a bottle of water, and retreated to my vehicle. As I locked the doors, I tried to shake off the nagging feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. Sleep eluded me that night. Every sound from outside, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, had me on high alert. I kept imagining Jake creeping around my van, trying to break in. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My eyes flew open, heart racing. It was still dark outside, but I could hear rain pattering on the roof. Another bang, and I realized someone was knocking on my van door. "Sarah," Jake's voice called out. "Sarah, please let me in. The tent is leaking. I'm soaked." I sat up, every muscle tense. "I'm sorry, Jake," I called back, "but I can't let you in. Try wrapping yourself in the sleeping bag. It's waterproof." "Come on," he pleaded. "Don't be like that. I'm freezing out here. Just let me in for a little while to dry off." His voice had an edge to it now, a hint of something dangerous lurking beneath the desperation. I reached for my phone, cursing silently when I remembered there was no service. "I can't, Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice firm. "I'm sorry, but you need to go back to the tent." There was silence for a moment, then a sound that made my blood run cold, the click of my door handle being tried. "Open the damn door, Sarah," Jake growled, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Don't make me break it down." Panic surged through me. I scrambled to the front seats, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. I had to get out of here. Just as I got the key in the ignition, I heard a loud crack. Jake had found a rock or a branch and was smashing it against my side window. The engine roared to life just as the window shattered. Jake's hand shot through the broken glass, grasping for the door lock. I threw the van into reverse, not caring about the gear-grinding shriek it produced. Jake's angry shouts followed me as I careened backwards down the narrow dirt road, rain lashing against the windshield. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I drove for hours, not stopping until the sun was high in the sky and I was 2 states away. When I finally pulled into a busy rest stop, the events of the night hit me like a tidal wave. I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Once I'd calmed down enough to think straight, I called the police. They took my statement and promised to investigate. But I knew the chances of them finding Jake were slim. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. My van, once my sanctuary, now felt vulnerable. Every noise in the night had me jumping. Every stranger's glance filled me with suspicion. I considered giving up the van life, returning to the safety of 4 solid walls and a deadbolt. But the thought of letting fear win, of giving up the freedom I'd fought so hard for, was unbearable. So instead, I adapted. I installed better locks and an alarm system in my van. I took self-defense classes and started carrying pepper spray. I joined online communities of solo female travelers, sharing safety tips and looking out for each other. Slowly, I reclaimed my sense of security. The open road called to me again, and I answered. But I never forgot the lesson I'd learned that night in the Ozarks. Now, when I park for the night, I'm more cautious. I trust my instincts. If a place or a person feels off, I move on. I'm still kind to strangers, but I'm no longer naive about the potential dangers they might pose. The van life is still my chosen path, but I walk it with open eyes. Because I've learned that true freedom isn't about being fearless. It's about facing your fears and choosing to live fully in spite of them. As I write this, I'm parked by a beautiful mountain lake, watching the sunset paint the sky. Tomorrow, I'll move on to somewhere new, carrying with me the strength and wisdom born from that terrifying night. The road ahead is long and sometimes dangerous, but I'm ready for whatever it might bring. Because now I know that the most important safety measure isn't a lock or an alarm. It's the courage to trust yourself and the determination to never let fear steal your dreams. The moment I heard the voices echoing through the abandoned hospital, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. What started as an urban explorer's dream quickly became a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My name's Alex, and I've been into urban exploration for years. There's something thrilling about sneaking into forgotten places, capturing the eerie beauty of decay with my camera. I'd explored dozens of abandoned buildings before, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the old St. Mary's Hospital. St. Mary's had been shut down for over a decade, a massive complex on the outskirts of the city that had fallen into disrepair. It was a urban explorer's holy grail, 5 stories of crumbling corridors, forgotten operating rooms, and who knows what else. I'd been planning this expedition for months, waiting for the perfect moonless night to make my move. Getting in was almost too easy. A loose board on a ground floor window, and I was inside. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and abandoned medical equipment. For the first hour, it was everything I'd hoped for. I snapped photos of an old nursery, glass still intact in the viewing window, empty cribs lined up like soldiers. I found patient files scattered across the floor of an admin office, the paper crumbling at my touch. In the cafeteria, trays were still stacked neatly, waiting for meals that would never be served. I was on the 3rd floor, exploring what looked like it had been a psychiatric ward, when I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere above me. I froze, my heart pounding. It had to be my imagination, I told myself, or maybe the wind playing tricks. But then I heard it again. 2 voices this time, a man and a woman, engaged in what sounded like an argument. They were too far away to make out the words, but the tone was clear, angry, intense. Every instinct told me to get out, to run back to my car and never look back. But curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was other urban explorers, I reasoned, or homeless people who'd set up camp in the upper floors. Either way, I had to know. I crept up the stairs, wincing at every creak of the old wood under my feet. The voices grew louder as I reached the 4th floor. They were coming from somewhere down the hall, behind a set of double doors marked Operating Theater. Pressing my ear to the door, I could finally make out what they were saying. "Can't keep doing this, John," the woman's voice hissed. "Someone's going to catch on." "Relax," the man replied, his tone dismissive. "We've been using this place for months. No one ever comes here." "But what if someone does? What if—" "Then we'll deal with it," he cut her off. Like we always do." A chill ran down my spine. Whatever these people were up to, it was clear they weren't just squatters or fellow explorers. I needed to get out of there, fast. I turned to leave, but in my haste, I knocked over a metal tray that had been balanced precariously on a nearby gurney. It clattered to the floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire building. The voices behind the door immediately went silent. Then, footsteps, moving quickly towards me. Panic surged through me. I sprinted down the hallway, not caring about the noise I was making. Behind me, I heard the double doors burst open. "Hey! Stop right there!" I ran faster than I ever had in my life, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I could hear them behind me, gaining ground. As I rounded a corner on the 2nd floor, a hand grabbed my jacket. I twisted away, hearing the fabric rip as I broke free. I burst out of the same window I'd entered through, stumbling as I hit the overgrown lawn. My car was parked a block away, hidden behind some trees. I reached it in what felt like seconds, fumbling with my keys as I heard shouts in the distance. As I peeled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of two figures emerging from the hospital in my rearview mirror. Even from a distance, I could see the glint of something metallic in the man's hand. A gun. I drove for hours, too terrified to stop. Every set of headlights behind me sent my heart racing. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I finally pulled over at a rest stop, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. What had I stumbled upon? Drug dealers? Some kind of black market operation? Whatever it was, I knew I was in way over my head. I debated going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd been trespassing in an abandoned hospital and overheard something suspicious? And what if these people had connections in law enforcement? The man had mentioned they'd been using the hospital for months without getting caught. In the end, I decided to lay low for a while. I called in sick to work, holed up in my apartment, and tried to convince myself that they hadn't gotten a good look at me or my car. But as the days passed, strange things started happening. I'd come home to find things slightly out of place, as if someone had been in my apartment. My computer files seemed to have been accessed when I knew I hadn't opened them. Twice, I could have sworn I saw the same car following me when I finally ventured out for groceries. Paranoia set in. I couldn't sleep, jumping at every sound. I stopped answering my phone, stopped checking my email. My friends started to worry, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what was going on. How could I explain the mess I'd gotten myself into? A week after the incident at the hospital, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. Heart pounding, I pushed it open. The place had been ransacked. Drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, but nothing seemed to be missing. On my kitchen table was a single piece of paper. On it, in neat handwriting, was a message that made my blood run cold. We know who you are. We know where you live. Keep your mouth shut, or next time we won't just look around. That was the breaking point. I threw some clothes in a bag, emptied my bank account, and hit the road. I drove for days, sleeping in my car, paying cash for everything. I ditched my phone, my credit cards, anything that could be used to track me. It's been 3 months since that night at St. Mary's. I'm in a small town now, thousands of miles from home, working under the table at a diner. I've dyed my hair, grown a beard, done everything I can to change my appearance, but I still don't feel safe. Every customer that comes into the diner could be one of them. Every car that drives by too slowly could be looking for me. I wake up in a cold sweat most nights, reliving those terrifying moments in the hospital. I know I can't run forever. Sooner or later, I'll have to face what happened. Maybe go to the FBI, tell them everything. But for now, all I can do is keep moving, keep looking over my shoulder. My urban exploring days are over. The thrill of sneaking into abandoned places seems hollow now, knowing the danger that can lurk in those forgotten corners. I've learned the hard way that some secrets are better left uncovered, some doors better left unopened. As I write this, sitting in my small rented room, I can't help but think about how quickly life can change. One moment of curiosity, one bad decision, and everything you know can be stripped away. To anyone out there thinking of exploring abandoned places, let my story be a warning. You never know what you might find in the darkness, and sometimes the real danger isn't in the crumbling buildings or rusty equipment. It's in the secrets those abandoned places keep and the people willing to do anything to protect them. I don't know what the future holds for me. Will I ever be able to go home? Will I ever feel safe again? These questions haunt me daily. But I do know one thing. I'll never again assume that an abandoned building is truly empty. Because sometimes, the most dangerous things lurk in the places we think have been left behind by the world. So if you're ever tempted to slip through that broken window or pry open that chained door, remember my story. Remember that some thrills come with a price too high to pay. And remember that in the world of urban exploration, the real ghosts aren't the ones from the past. They're the very real, very dangerous ones hiding in the shadows of the present. The moment I discovered the hidden door in my basement, I knew my life would never be the same. But I never imagined it would lead me into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. My name's Emma, and I just bought my first house, a charming Victorian fixer-upper on the outskirts of town. It was a dream come true, a place of my own where I could finally put down roots after years of apartment living. The previous owner had been eager to sell, practically giving it away. I should have known it was too good to be true. I'd been living in the house for about a month, slowly unpacking and making it my own. The basement was the last frontier, a cluttered space filled with dusty boxes and forgotten junk from the previous owner. I'd been putting off tackling it, but finally decided it was time to face the mess. I was sorting through a pile of old magazines when my hand brushed against something cold and metallic behind a stack of boxes. Curious, I pushed the boxes aside and found myself staring at a small, ornate door handle. My heart raced as I cleared away more debris, revealing a door I hadn't noticed before. It was made of dark, aged wood, with intricate carvings around the frame. It looked old, much older than the rest of the house. I tried the handle, but it was locked. A thorough search of the basement yielded no key. Frustrated but intrigued, I went upstairs to grab my toolbox. Whatever was behind that door, I was determined to find out. It took some doing, but I finally managed to jimmy the lock open. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dark room beyond. The smell hit me first, musty and damp, with an underlying odor I couldn't quite place. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was tiny, maybe 6 feet square. The walls were covered in strange symbols and writing, some of it looking like it had been scrawled in blood. In the center of the room was a small table, and on it sat a collection of items that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. Old bones, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and a large leather-bound book. I approached the table cautiously, my curiosity overriding my fear. The book seemed to call to me. I reached out, my hand trembling, and opened it. The pages were filled with more of the strange writing I'd seen on the walls. Interspersed were disturbing drawings, grotesque creatures, violent rituals, things that made my stomach churn. But what really caught my eye were the photographs. They were old, sepia-toned, showing people in various states of torture and dismemberment. And with a jolt of horror, I realized I recognized one of them. It was my house. This house, but from many years ago. In the foreground was a man with a cruel smile, standing over a terrified woman bound to a chair. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. I needed to get out of there, to call the police, to do something. But as I turned to leave, I heard a noise that made my blood freeze in my veins. Footsteps, coming from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that I knew didn't belong to me. I stood paralyzed with fear, my mind racing. Had I left the front door unlocked? No, I was sure I hadn't. So how? The footsteps were moving now, heading towards the basement stairs. I looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the room was too small, too exposed. In desperation, I ducked behind the open door, pressing myself against the wall. It was a pathetic hiding spot, but it was all I had. The basement door opened, and the footsteps descended the stairs. They were slow, measured, as if the person knew exactly where they were going. I held my breath as they approached the hidden room. Please, I thought, please don't let them find me. But luck wasn't on my side. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. There was a moment of terrible silence, and then a voice spoke, deep, gravelly, and filled with malice. I know you're in there, it said. I can smell your fear. I couldn't help it. I let out a small whimper. The voice chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Come out wherever you are. It sing-songed, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." My mind raced. Maybe if I stayed quiet, they'd think they were mistaken and leave. But even as I had the thought, I knew it was futile. Whoever this was, they knew I was here. With trembling legs, I stepped out from behind the door. The figure standing there made my heart stop. He was tall, impossibly tall, dressed in a long black coat that seemed to absorb the light around it, but it was his face that truly terrified me. It was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that glowed an unnatural red. His mouth was stretched in a grin that was far too wide, revealing rows of sharp-pointed teeth. "There you are," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "I've been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The creature, for I knew now that this was no man, reached out a long, clawed hand towards me. "Don't be afraid," he crooned. "This will only hurt. Well, actually, it will hurt quite a lot, but it will be over soon." In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. I ducked under his outstretched arm and ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life. I took the basement stairs 2 at a time, his laughter echoing behind me. I burst out of the front door, not stopping until I reached my car. With shaking hands, I managed to get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the driveway, I saw him standing on the porch, that terrible grin still on his face. He raised a hand in a mocking wave as I sped away. I drove for hours, too terrified to stop. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I finally pulled over at a rest stop, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. What had I seen? What was that thing? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? I couldn't go to the police. What would I tell them? That I'd found a secret room full of occult items and been chased out of my house by a monster. They'd think I was crazy. In the end, I decided to go to a hotel. I needed time to think, to process what had happened. But as the days passed, I found myself jumping at every shadow, convinced that the creature from my basement was going to find me. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that terrible grin, those glowing red eyes. I lost weight, my appearance becoming gaunt and haggard. After a week, I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to face whatever was in that house. I had to know the truth. I returned home on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The house looked exactly as I'd left it, peaceful and innocent in the daylight. But I knew better now. With trembling hands, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was silent, but I could feel a presence, watching and waiting. I made my way down to the basement, my heart pounding with each step. The hidden door stood open, revealing the small room beyond. But it was empty now. No table, no book, no disturbing artifacts, just bare walls and a dusty floor. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, that the stress of buying a new house had caused some kind of mental break. But then I saw it, a single piece of paper lying in the center of the room. With shaking hands, I picked it up. On it, in elegant script, was a message that made my blood run cold. "The game has begun. I'll see you again soon." I ran from the house, never to return. I sold it for a fraction of what I'd paid, not caring about the financial loss. I just needed to be rid of it. It's been 5 years since that day. I've moved across the country, changed my name, done everything I can to forget. But I know deep down that it's not over. Sometimes, in my dreams, I hear that gravelly voice, see that terrible grin, and I know that someday, when I least expect it, the game will begin again. So if you're thinking of buying an old house, of exploring that hidden nook or long-forgotten room, take it from me. Sometimes, the things we uncover are better left buried, because once you open that door, you can never truly close it again. The night I caught art thieves in the act was the night I learned that sometimes the most valuable things we protect aren't hanging on the walls. It was also the night I almost lost everything, including my life. My name's Mike, and I've been working night security at the Hillsdale Museum of Fine Arts for going on 5 years now. It's usually a quiet gig, just me, the cameras, and millions of dollars worth of art. At least, that's how it was until that fateful Friday night in October. I just started my shift, settling into the small security office with a thermos of coffee and the novel I'd been working my way through all week. The museum was eerily quiet, as always. Just the soft hum of the climate control system and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Around midnight, I started my first round. I always enjoyed these walks through the darkened galleries. There was something magical about seeing the artwork in the dim emergency lighting, like I was getting a private showing of some of the world's greatest masterpieces. I was in the modern art wing when I first noticed something was off. It was subtle, just a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere ahead. I paused, straining my ears. There it was again, followed by what sounded like a whispered curse. My heart started to race. In 5 years, I'd never encountered anything more exciting than a tripped motion sensor. But this was different. I radioed into Central Dispatch, keeping my voice low. "This is Mike at Hillsdale. I've got suspicious noises in the modern wing. Going to investigate." "Copy that, Mike," came the crackly reply. "Be careful. Backup's on standby if you need it." I unclipped my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. Slowly, I made my way towards the source of the sound. As I got closer, I could make out hushed voices. "Hurry up with that, will you? We don't have all night." "I'm going as fast as I can. This security system is more complicated than we thought." I peered around a corner and my blood ran cold. 3 figures dressed in black were huddled around the case containing our prize exhibit, a priceless Picasso on loan from a private collector. One of them was working on the case's lock, while another held some kind of electronic device. The third kept watch, his head swiveling back and forth. I ducked back behind the corner, my mind racing. This was really happening. Art thieves, right here in my museum. I'd trained for this, but now that it was actually happening, I felt woefully unprepared. I reached for my radio to call for backup, but hesitated. What if they heard me? They'd be gone before help arrived, taking the Picasso with them. Taking a deep breath, I made a decision. I had to stall them, keep them here until the police arrived. It was risky, but I couldn't let them get away with this. I stepped out from my hiding spot, flashlight raised. "Freeze! Security!" The thieves whirled around, startled. For a moment, nobody moved. Then everything happened at once. The one by the case lunged for a bag on the floor. The one with the electronic device threw it at me. I ducked, and it shattered against the wall behind me. The third, the lookout, came at me with surprising speed. I managed to sidestep his first swing, but his second caught me in the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I stumbled back, gasping for air. "Grab the painting and let's go," one of them shouted. Through watering eyes, I saw them working frantically to open the case. I had to do something fast. I fumbled for the panic button on my belt, pressing it repeatedly. Immediately, alarms began blaring throughout the museum. The thieves cursed, redoubling their efforts. I staggered to my feet, determined to stop them, but the lookout was on me again, throwing me against a nearby sculpture. Pain exploded in my back, and I heard something crack. Whether it was the sculpture or my ribs, I couldn't tell. "Got it!" one of the thieves yelled triumphantly. Through the haze of pain, I saw them carefully lifting the Picasso from its case. "No!" I shouted, lurching towards them. The lookout caught me, pinning me against the wall. "What do we do with him?" he asked, his voice muffled by his mask. The one holding the painting looked at me, then at his watch. "No time. He's seen our faces. Take care of him." The lookout nodded, reaching into his jacket. I saw the glint of metal and realized with horror that he was pulling out a gun. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, could feel every ache and pain in my body. This was it. I was going to die here, surrounded by priceless art, killed by thieves I'd failed to stop. But then, a sound cut through the alarms and the ringing in my ears. Sirens, police sirens, growing louder by the second. The thieves heard it too. "Shit," the leader cursed. "We gotta go now." The one holding me hesitated, the gun still pointed at my chest. "But he's seen us." "There's no time. Leave him." With a frustrated growl, the lookout slammed me against the wall one last time. My head cracked against the hard surface and the world went fuzzy. I slid to the floor, fighting to stay conscious. Through blurry vision, I saw the thieves running towards the emergency exit, the Picasso tucked carefully under one of their arms. With the last of my strength, I grabbed for the nearest thing I could reach, a small modern art sculpture made of twisted metal. I hurled it at the retreating figures. By some miracle, it hit its mark. The sculpture tangled in the legs of the thief carrying the painting. He went down hard, the Picasso flying from his grasp. "Leave it!" the leader shouted as the fallen thief scrambled for the painting. The sirens were deafening now, right outside the building. The three thieves disappeared through the emergency exit just as the main doors burst open, police flooding in with guns drawn. What followed was a blur of paramedics, police questions, and crime scene techs. I learned later that while the thieves had escaped, they'd left behind crucial evidence in their haste. The painting was safe, if a bit scuffed from its fall. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, an ice pack pressed to my throbbing head, the museum director approached me. Her face was pale, but her eyes were shining. "Mike," she said, taking my hand, "you saved the Picasso. You saved all of it. I don't know how to thank you." I managed a weak smile. "Just doing my job, ma'am." But as I was driven to the hospital for a checkup, I realized it had been more than that. In those terrifying moments, it hadn't just been about protecting the art. It had been about standing up to those who thought they could take whatever they wanted. Consequences be damned. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. There were more police interviews, a commendation from the mayor, even a small write-up in the local paper. The museum upgraded its security system and offered me a promotion. But every night, when I walk my rounds through those quiet galleries, I can't help but see it all again. The thieves, the struggle, the moment I thought it was all over. It's changed me, that night. Made me realize how quickly everything can change, how thin the line is between safety and danger. I still love this job, still feel that same magic when I'm alone with the art at night. But now I carry with me the knowledge that at any moment, it could all be put to the test again. And I know that if it does, I'll be ready. Because that night taught me that sometimes, the most priceless things aren't the ones in the display cases. Sometimes, they're the moments of courage we find within ourselves when everything is on the line. So if you're ever in the Hillsdale Museum of Fine Arts, take a moment to really look at that Picasso. And remember that behind every priceless work of art, there are people willing to put everything on the line to protect it. Because some things are worth more than just their price tag. They're a part of our shared human legacy, and that's something worth fighting for. I never thought a simple hiking trip would lead me face to face with a dangerous fugitive. But as I crouched behind a tree, heart pounding, I realized that sometimes the most perilous predators aren't the wild animals we prepare for, but the humans we never see coming. My name's Jack, and I've always been an avid hiker. There's something about losing myself in nature that helps clear my mind and recharge my soul. So when I had a week off work, I decided to tackle a challenging trail in the Rockies I'd been eyeing for years. The first 3 days were everything I'd hoped for. Breathtaking views, crisp mountain air, and the kind of solitude you can only find miles away from civilization. I'd seen some wildlife, a few deer, a distant bear, even a majestic eagle soaring overhead. But on day 4, I encountered a predator of a different kind. I had set up camp for the night in a small clearing near a babbling brook. As I sat by my campfire, enjoying a freeze-dried meal and the sounds of nature, I heard something that made me freeze mid-bite. Voices, human voices, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. At first, I thought it might be other hikers, but this far out on the trail, it was unlikely. I hadn't seen another soul in days, and there was something about the tone, urgent, angry, that set my nerves on edge. I doused my fire and retreated to my tent, straining my ears. The voices were getting closer. I could make out two distinct speakers, both male, one gruff and authoritative, the other higher-pitched and nervous. "We need to keep moving," the gruff voice was saying. "They'll have figured out where we are by now." "I can't," the other voice whined. "I'm exhausted. We've been walking for days. You want to go back to prison? Because that's what'll happen if they catch us. Now move." My blood ran cold. Prison. These weren't just lost hikers or campers. They were escapees. Fugitives. I held my breath as their footsteps drew nearer. A beam from a flashlight swept across my tent, and I heard the gruff voice curse. "Someone's camped here, recently. So, we haven't seen anyone for days. Doesn't matter. They could report seeing us. We need to find them." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I had to get out of there, but how? My car was a 2-day hike away, and in the darkness, I'd be at a severe disadvantage. As quietly as I could, I grabbed my backpack and slipped out the back of my tent. The fugitives were on the other side, their flashlight beams dancing through the trees as they searched the area. I crept away from my campsite, using the sound of the brook to mask any noise I might make. But I'd only gone about 50 yards when I heard a shout. "Hey, there's someone over there!" I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit close behind. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and those men as possible. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like lead. But fear kept me going, the imagined feeling of rough hands grabbing me, spurring me on. Finally, I couldn't run anymore. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for air. The forest around me was silent. Had I lost them? As my breathing slowed, I started to take stock of my situation. I was lost, alone in the wilderness, with dangerous criminals potentially still looking for me. My tent and most of my supplies were back at the campsite. All I had was what was in my backpack, some water, a few energy bars, a flashlight, and my first aid kit. I needed to find somewhere to hide, to rest and think. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I spotted a large fallen tree a few yards away. Its upturned roots created a small, sheltered space. Not comfortable, but it would have to do. I crawled into the space, curling up as small as I could. Every sound made me flinch, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I was sure at any moment I'd hear the fugitives crashing through the undergrowth, coming to find me. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in. Despite my fear, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the roots of my hiding place. Cautiously, I peeked out. The forest was peaceful in the early morning light. No sign of the fugitives. But I knew I couldn't let my guard down. I needed a plan. My best bet was to try to make it back to my car. But without my tent and supplies, it would be a grueling journey. And what if the fugitives were still out there, looking for me? As I was weighing my options, I heard a sound that made my heart leap. The rhythmic thump of helicopter blades. Search and rescue, or maybe the police, looking for the escapees. I scrambled out of my hiding place, looking for a clearing where I might be visible from the air. As I moved, I heard voices again, but these were different from the night before. Organized, professional sounding. Team Alpha, sweep the east quadrant. Beta, take the west. Remember, these men are considered dangerous. Do not approach without backup. Relief flooded through me. It was the police. I was saved. I started towards the voices, but then hesitated. What if the fugitives heard them too? What if they were desperate enough to grab a hostage? My fears were confirmed moments later when I heard frantic movement behind me. I turned to see the two men from the night before, looking wild-eyed and desperate. The gruff-voiced one spotted me and his eyes narrowed. "You," he growled. "You brought them here, didn't you?" I backed away, hands raised. "No, I swear. I'm just a hiker. I don't want any trouble." "Well, you've found it," he said, advancing on me. "Looks like we've got ourselves a ticket out of here, eh, Jimmy?" The other man, Jimmy, looked uncertain. "I don't know, Frank. Maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Frank snapped. He turned back to me. "You're coming with us. One wrong move and you'll regret it." My mind raced. I couldn't let them take me hostage, but they were bigger than me, and probably armed. I needed to stall, to keep them here until the police found us. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll go with you, but I need to get my backpack. It has water and food. We'll need it if we're going to evade the cops." Frank hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but no funny business." I led them back to where I'd hidden, moving as slowly as I dared. All the while, I could hear the search teams getting closer. As we reached the fallen tree, I had an idea. It was risky, but it was all I had. I knelt down, pretending to reach for my backpack, but instead, I grabbed a handful of dirt and leaves. In one motion, I spun around and threw it in Frank's face. He yelled, momentarily blinded. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I ran, screaming at the top of my lungs. "Help! Over here! The fugitives are here!" I heard shouts of confusion, then the sound of many feet running. Suddenly, the forest was alive with activity, police officers converging from all directions. "Freeze! Police!" I dropped to the ground, hands over my head. There was a brief scuffle, more shouting, and then silence. When I finally dared to look up, I saw Frank and Jimmy being led away in handcuffs. A kind-faced officer was helping me to my feet. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. "Are you the hiker they radioed us about?" I nodded, suddenly feeling lightheaded with relief. "Yes, that's me. I found them. Or they found me, I guess." The next few hours passed in a blur of statements and medical checkups. I learned that Frank and Jimmy had escaped from a medium-security prison several states over. They'd been on the run for weeks. As I was finally cleared to leave, the officer in charge approached me. "You did good out there," he said. "Not many people would have kept their cool like that. You should be proud." I managed a weak smile. I was terrified the whole time. He chuckled. "That's what bravery is, son. Being scared but doing the right thing anyway." As I was driven back to my car, I couldn't help but reflect on the past 24 hours. I'd gone into those woods looking for solitude and found more danger than I'd ever encountered in my life. But I'd also found a strength in myself I didn't know I had. I'd faced my fears and come out the other side. I still love hiking, still find peace in the wilderness. But now I carry with me the knowledge that danger can come in many forms, and that sometimes the most important survival skill is keeping a cool head in a crisis. So if you're ever out in the wild and hear something that doesn't quite fit, trust your instincts. Because sometimes the most dangerous animals in the forest walk on two legs, and the most important trails we blaze are the ones that lead us to discovering our own courage. The moment I saw the shadowy figures moving around the cabin, I knew this peaceful getaway had turned into a fight for survival. What started as a simple house-sitting job became a night of terror that would haunt me for years to come. My name's Sarah, and I'm a grad student trying to make ends meet. When my professor asked if I'd watch her remote cabin for a week while she attended a conference, I jumped at the chance. A quiet place to study, surrounded by nature. It sounded perfect. The first few days were blissful. The cabin was cozy, with a wraparound porch and views of the surrounding forest that took my breath away. I spent my days reading, working on my thesis, and taking long walks in the woods. At night, I'd curl up by the fireplace, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. I was making dinner, humming along to the radio when the power suddenly cut out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. At first, I wasn't too concerned. Power outages weren't uncommon in such a remote area. I found the flashlight my professor had shown me and went to check the circuit breaker. As I passed by the living room window, a movement outside caught my eye. I froze, peering into the darkness. There, at the edge of the cleared area around the cabin, I saw them, 3 figures, moving with purpose towards the house. My heart began to race. This far out, unexpected visitors were rare, and something about the way they moved, staying low and in the shadows, set off alarm bells in my head. I quickly turned off my flashlight and ducked down below the window. Maybe they hadn't seen me. Maybe they'd go away if they thought the cabin was empty. But as I crouched there, hardly daring to breathe, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The snip of wire cutters. They were cutting the phone line. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no way to call for help. My cell phone was useless out here, no signal for miles. I had to think. What were my options? I could try to run, but in the dark forest, I'd be at a disadvantage. They probably knew these woods better than I did. Hiding seemed like the best option, but where? As I heard the creak of footsteps on the porch, I made my decision. I grabbed my backpack, shoving in a bottle of water and some granola bars. Then I slipped into the root cellar my professor had shown me, in case of bad storms. I pulled the heavy door closed just as I heard the sound of breaking glass. They were inside. The root cellar was small and musty, lined with shelves of canned goods and old gardening equipment. I wedged myself into a corner behind some boxes, trying to calm my breathing. Above me, I could hear them moving around the cabin. The thud of drawers being opened, the crash of things being overturned. What were they looking for? Check everywhere, a gruff voice commanded. The boss says it's got to be here somewhere. What about the girl? Another voice asked. My heart nearly stopped. They knew I was here. Find her, the first voice growled. She might have seen where the old lady hid it. Hide what? What could my professor have that these men wanted so badly? I heard the cellar door creak open and held my breath. Flashlight beams swept the room, passing over my hiding spot once, twice. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain that at any moment I'd be discovered. But then the door closed and I heard receding footsteps. They hadn't seen me. For now. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, every muscle tense, straining to hear what was happening above. It felt like hours. Eventually, the noises stopped. Had they left? I waited, counting to 1,000 in my head before I dared to move. Slowly, carefully, I eased out of my hiding spot. My legs were cramped, and pins and needles shot through my feet as I stood. I crept to the cellar door and listened. Silence. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open a crack and peeked out. The cabin was a disaster. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor. But it seemed empty. I slipped out of the cellar, my eyes darting around for any sign of the intruders. Nothing. Had they really gone? Just as I started to relax, I heard the rumble of an engine outside. Headlights swept across the windows as a vehicle pulled up. I ducked down behind the couch, my heart pounding. The car door slammed, and heavy footsteps approached the cabin. Find anything? A new voice called out. Nothing, came the reply from outside. Place is clean. No sign of the document or the girl. Document. What document could be so important? Keep looking, the newcomer ordered. Tear the place apart if you have to, and find that girl. She must be around here somewhere. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin. It was only a matter of time before they found me. I needed to get out, to find help. The back door was only a few feet away. If I could make it there, I might have a chance to slip into the woods unnoticed. Taking a deep breath, I crawled towards the door, staying low to avoid the windows. Just as I reached for the handle, a floorboard creaked beneath me. The cabin went silent. Then, footsteps, moving quickly in my direction. I didn't think. I yanked the door open and ran. Behind me, I heard shouts and the sound of pursuit. I plunged into the dark forest, branches whipping at my face as I ran blindly through the undergrowth. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and those men as possible. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Finally, I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed behind a large tree, gasping for air. As my breathing slowed, I strained my ears for any sound of pursuit. Nothing but the normal nighttime sounds of the forest. Had I lost them? Or were they out there still, searching methodically through the woods? I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to find help, to get to the authorities somehow. But in which direction? In the panic of my flight, I'd lost all sense of direction. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost in the woods in the middle of the night, being hunted by dangerous men. I had no phone, no way to call for help, and I had no idea what they wanted or why they were after me. I allowed myself a moment of despair, a few silent tears sliding down my cheeks. Then I took a deep breath and forced myself to think. My professor had mentioned a ranger station about 5 miles east of the cabin. If I could find it, I'd be safe. But how to know which way was east? I looked up, searching for the stars through the canopy of leaves. There, the Big Dipper. I oriented myself, picking out east. It wasn't much, but it was a direction. It was hope. Gathering my remaining strength, I set off. I moved as quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. I walked for what felt like hours. My feet were blistered, my legs aching, but I didn't dare stop. Every time I felt like giving up, I imagined those men finding me, and it spurred me on. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A faint glow through the trees. The ranger station. Relief flooded through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I stumbled out of the woods into the station's parking lot just as the sun was beginning to rise. The ranger on duty was shocked by my appearance, dirty, scratched, and wild-eyed. But he listened to my story and immediately called the police. The next few days were a blur of police statements and newspaper interviews. It turned out my professor was involved in a high-profile whistleblower case. The men had been searching for documents that could implicate some very powerful people. They caught most of the men who had broken into the cabin, but their leader remained at large. For weeks, I jumped at every shadow, convinced he was coming to silence me. It's been a year since that night, and I still have nightmares about running through those dark woods. I've moved to the city, finding comfort in the constant noise and light. My thesis remains unfinished. I can't bring myself to look at the research I was doing that week. But slowly, I'm reclaiming my life. I'm learning that survival isn't just about outrunning danger. It's about facing your fears and moving forward, one day at a time. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again, but I do know that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible. And if I could survive that night in the woods, I can survive anything. So if you ever find yourself alone in a remote cabin and something feels off, trust your instincts. Sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't the ones with claws and fangs, but the ones who walk on 2 legs and have secrets to protect. The moment I heard those hushed voices coming from the supposedly empty floor, I knew my mundane job as a night janitor had just become a front-row seat to something sinister. What I discovered that night would change my life forever, plunging me into a world of danger I never knew existed. My name's Dave, and I've been working nights at Apex Corporation for the past 3 years. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and gives me time to work on my novel during the quiet hours. At least, that's what I thought until that fateful Tuesday night. I was on the 37th floor, mopping the endless expanse of polished tiles, when I heard it. Voices, low and urgent, coming from the executive boardroom. At first, I thought I was imagining things. This floor was supposed to be empty. Hell, the whole building was supposed to be empty except for security and us cleaning staff. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer to the boardroom, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. As I neared the door, left slightly ajar, the voices became clearer. "The shipment arrives tomorrow night," a deep voice was saying. "We need to make sure everything's in place." "What about the feds?" another voice asked, higher pitched and nervous. "They've been sniffing around lately." "Leave them to me," the first voice replied, a hint of menace in his tone. "I've got people in place. They won't be a problem." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just some late-night meeting. This was something illegal, something dangerous. I must have made a noise, a gasp, a shift of my weight, because suddenly the voices stopped. I heard chairs scraping against the floor. "Did you hear that?" the nervous voice asked. "Check it out," the deeper voice commanded. Panic surged through me. I looked around frantically for a place to hide. The hallway was long and open, with nowhere to conceal myself. In desperation, I ducked into a nearby supply closet, pulling the door closed just as I heard footsteps approaching. Through the thin crack between the door and the frame, I saw a man in an expensive suit walk past, his head swiveling as he scanned the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. After what felt like an eternity, he returned to the boardroom. "Nothing out there," I heard him say. "Must have been the wind or something." I stayed frozen in that closet, barely daring to breathe, as the meeting continued. They talked about shipments, payoffs, and taking cares of people who got in their way. It was like something out of a crime movie, except this was real, and I was trapped in the middle of it. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I heard them preparing to leave. I waited until their footsteps had faded and the elevator dinged in the distance before I dared to emerge from my hiding spot. My mind was racing. What should I do? Go to the police. But what if these people had connections in law enforcement, like they'd hinted? What if they found out I was the one who reported them? I finished my shift in a daze, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment those men would return and discover that I'd overheard them. By the time I clocked out at 6 a.m., I'd made a decision. I needed proof before I went to the authorities. The next night, I came to work with a small voice recorder hidden in my pocket. It was a risk, but I needed evidence. If I could record one of their conversations, maybe the police would have to take me seriously. As I worked my way through the building's floors, I kept an ear out for any unusual sounds. For hours, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I was beginning to think that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that the stress of working nights had finally gotten to me. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Voices, coming from the same boardroom. My heart started racing as I approached, recorder at the ready. This time, there were more of them. I could make out at least 5 distinct voices, all talking about the shipment that was due to arrive that night. They mentioned a warehouse down by the docks and a time 3:30 a.m. I recorded for as long as I dared, then slipped away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely push the mop. I had it. Evidence of whatever criminal enterprise was operating out of Apex Corporation. But now that I was even more terrified. If they found out, I was as good as dead. I to the authorities immediately. I made my way to the ground floor, planning to slip out early and head straight to the police station. But as the elevator doors opened, my heart sank. There in the lobby were 2 of the men I'd seen leaving the boardroom the night before, and they were looking right at me. "Well, well," one of them said, his voice chillingly familiar. It was the deep-voiced man from the meetings. "What are you doing here so late, janitor?" I swallowed. "Just, my shift, sir." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I could have sworn I saw you up on the 37th floor earlier, but that's not part of your usual routine, is it? They knew. Somehow, they knew I'd been listening. I think you'd better come with us, the other man said, reaching for my arm. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I shoved my mop cart at them, causing them to stumble. In the confusion, I burst out into the cool night air, running as fast as I could. I could hear shouts behind me, the sound of pursuit growing closer. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, just a few late-night revelers and early morning workers. I darted down alleys, vaulted over fences, anything to lose my pursuers. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead, but fear kept me going. Finally, I saw it, the police station, its lights a beacon of hope in the pre-dawn darkness. I staggered through the doors, gasping for breath. The desk sergeant looked up in alarm. "Please," I panted. "You have to help me. They're after me. I have evidence. Criminal activity. Apex Corporation." The next few hours passed in a blur. I gave my statement, handed over the recording. More officers arrived, detectives in suits who asked me to go over my story again and again. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows through the station windows, one of the detectives approached me. His face was grim. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "I want you to know that what you've done here is incredibly brave. The information you've provided, well, let's just say it goes a lot deeper than we initially thought. We're going to need to place you in protective custody." The reality of my situation began to sink in. I'd uncovered something big, something dangerous, and now my life would never be the same. The next few months were a whirlwind of safe houses, court appearances, and constant looking over my shoulder. The case against Apex Corporation and its executives made national headlines. It turned out they were involved in everything from money laundering to human trafficking. Thanks to my evidence, most of the ring was brought down. But a few key players remained at large, including the deep-voiced man who'd confronted me that night. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear footsteps outside my door. I've changed my name, moved across the country, started a new life, but I can never quite shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I often think back to that night, to the moment I decided to investigate those voices instead of minding my own business. Sometimes I regret it, wishing I could go back to my simple life of mopping floors and dreaming of being a writer. But then I remember the lives that were saved because of what I uncovered, the victims who found justice. And I know that, despite everything, I made the right choice. So if you're ever working late and hear something you shouldn't, remember my story. Sometimes the most important cleaning up isn't done with a mop and bucket, but with the courage to expose the dirt that others want to keep hidden. Just be prepared. Once you step into that world, there's no going back to blissful ignorance. The truth, I've learned, is a powerful and dangerous thing. But in the end, it's all we have to fight the darkness that lurks in the shadows of gleaming corporate towers and behind closed boardroom doors. The day we moved into our dream home, I never imagined we'd be sharing it with the nightmares of its past. But as the walls whispered their secrets and shadows moved of their own accord, we realized that some houses never truly let go of their former occupants. I'm Emily, and my husband Jack and I have been searching for the perfect family home for months. When we stumbled upon the old Victorian on Maple Street, it seemed too good to be true. Spacious rooms, a sprawling backyard, and a price that was surprisingly within our budget. We were so excited, we barely listened to the real estate agent's rushed explanation about the previous owner's hasty departure. The first few weeks were blissful. We painted walls, arranged furniture, and started to make the house our own. Our two kids, Lily and Max, were thrilled with their new rooms and the treehouse in the backyard. It felt like we'd finally found our forever home. But then, little things started happening. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A door closing on its own, objects not quite where we'd left them. We laughed it off as forgetfulness or the quirks of an old house. It was about a month after we'd moved in that things took a turn for the unsettling. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when I heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate steps, moving from room to room. "Jack," I called out, assuming he'd come home early from work. No response. I climbed the stairs, a sense of unease growing with each step. The second floor was empty, all the doors closed. As I stood there, puzzled, I heard a child's laughter coming from behind me. I whirled around, expecting to see Lily or Max, but the hallway was empty. That night, I mentioned it to Jack. He looked concerned but tried to rationalize it. "Old houses make weird noises, Em. It's probably just settling." But the incidents kept piling up. Lily complained about someone whispering her name when she was alone in her room. Max's toys would be arranged in strange patterns when we woke up in the morning. And more than once, I caught glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye, always vanishing when I turned to look. It all came to a head one stormy night about 2 months after we'd moved in. A thunderclap woke me from a fitful sleep. As lightning illuminated the room, I saw a figure standing at the foot of our bed. It was a woman, her face gaunt and eyes hollow, staring directly at me. I screamed, startling Jack awake. But when he turned on the light, she was gone. Shaken, we checked on the kids. Lily was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "The sad lady was here again," she whimpered. "She said we need to leave before they come back." That was the final straw. The next morning, we started researching the history of the house. What we found chilled us to the bone. The previous owners, the Harrises, had disappeared without a trace 3 years ago. The case had gone cold, but there were whispers of strange occurrences in the house, of the family's increasing paranoia in the weeks before they vanished. Digging deeper, we uncovered a pattern. Every family that had lived in the house for the past century had either moved out abruptly or met with tragedy. Accidents, disappearances, sudden illnesses. The house seemed to be a magnet for misfortune. We were debating what to do when Max came running into the room, his eyes wide with excitement. "I made new friends," he exclaimed. "They live in the walls and they want to play hide and seek." A chill ran down my spine. "Max, honey, what do you mean they live in the walls?" He pointed to a small vent near the floor, one I'd never paid much attention to before. "They come out from there. They're funny looking, but they're nice. They said they've been waiting for someone to play with for a long time." Jack and I exchanged worried glances. That night, after the kids were asleep, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and a healthy dose of fear, we approached the vent Max had pointed out. Jack unscrewed it carefully, revealing a dark space beyond. As he shone his flashlight into the opening, we both gasped. There was a narrow passageway, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. "Should we?" I hesitated, fear battling with curiosity. Jack nodded grimly. "We need to know what we're dealing with." He went first, squeezing into the tight space. I followed, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was in there would hear it. The passage twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the bowels of the house. The air grew stale, and I could swear I heard whispers echoing around us. Finally, the passage opened up into a small room. As our flashlights swept the space, I had to stifle a scream. The walls were covered in drawings, crude, childlike sketches of people screaming, of dark figures looming over them. And in the center of the room was a collection of objects, toys, jewelry, wallets, things that must have belonged to previous occupants of the house. But what made my blood run cold was the fresh crayon drawing pinned to one wall. It showed our family, Jack, me, Lily, and Max, surrounded by smiling stick figures. Underneath, in a child's scrawl, were the words, "New friends to play with forever." We scrambled out of there as fast as we could, our minds reeling. What were we going to do? We couldn't stay, but who would believe us if we told them the truth? As we emerged from the vent, dusty and shaken, we found Lily and Max standing in the hallway, their eyes wide and unfocused. "They're coming," Lily said, her voice eerily calm. They want us to join them. Suddenly, the house came alive with noise, banging on the walls, scratching sounds from inside the vents, and a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We didn't stop to pack. Grabbing the kids, we ran for the car, the sounds of chaos following us. As we peeled out of the driveway, I looked back at the house. In every window, I could see faces, dozens of them, pressed against the glass, watching us leave. We drove through the night, not stopping until we were several states away. We left everything behind, our possessions, our jobs, our lives. But we had each other, and we were safe. That's all that mattered. It's been a year since that night. We've started over in a new town, in a new house, a newly built one, with no history and no hidden passages in the walls. But sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can hear whispers coming from the vents, or see shadows moving just out of sight. We never reported what happened to the authorities. Who would believe us? But I often think about that house on Maple Street, still standing, still looking for its next unsuspecting family. I wonder about the Harrises and all the others who came before us. Are they still there, trapped in the walls, forever seeking new playmates? I've learned that some houses are more than just wood and nails. Some have a life of their own, a hunger that can never be satisfied. And sometimes, the most dangerous monsters are the ones we invite into our homes, thinking we're the ones moving in when really, we're the ones being consumed. So if you're ever house hunting and you find a place that seems too good to be true, perfect location, great price, but with a history that's a little too vague, think twice. Listen to the walls, watch the shadows, because you never know who or what you might be sharing your dream home with. And if you hear whispers in the night or see movement out of the corner of your eye, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Sometimes, the smartest thing you can do is run, leaving everything behind, because some things are worth more than a house. Your family, your sanity, your soul. We were lucky. We got out before it was too late. But I often wonder about the next family that will move into that house on Maple Street. Will they hear the whispers? Will they see the shadows? Or will they become just another set of faces pressed against the windows, watching and waiting for new friends to join them in the walls? The moment my car sputtered to a stop on that deserted road, I knew I was in trouble. But when the Good Samaritan pulled over to help, I realized that sometimes the real danger isn't being stranded. It's being rescued by the wrong person. My name's Sarah, and I've always prided myself on being independent and self-reliant. So when my beat-up Honda started making weird noises halfway through my cross-country road trip, I figured I could handle it. I mean, how hard could it be to get to the next town and find a mechanic? Turns out, pretty damn hard when your car decides to give up the ghost in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. It was just past sunset, that eerie twilight time when the world seemed suspended between day and night. The road stretched out endlessly in both directions, nothing but fields, and the occasional skeleton of a long-abandoned barn as far as the eye could see. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, willing it to reveal its secrets. But let's be real, I wouldn't know a carburetor from a catalytic converter if my life depended on it. And as the darkness deepened and the temperature dropped, I was starting to worry that it might. I checked my phone for the millionth time. Still no signal. Of course, just as I was contemplating the wisdom of starting to walk, even though I had no idea which direction would lead me to civilization, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Relief washed over me. Finally, someone who could help. I waved my arms, feeling a bit silly but desperate enough not to care. The vehicle, a large pickup truck, slowed as it approached. It pulled over about 20 feet behind my car, its headlights illuminating the scene in harsh white light. A man got out and started walking towards me. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Car trouble," he called out, his voice friendly enough. I nodded, suddenly feeling a bit uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "Yeah, It just died on me. I don't suppose you know anything about cars." He chuckled, coming closer. "I might know a thing or two. Mind if I take a look?" I stepped back, gesturing towards the open hood. As he leaned in to examine the engine, I caught a whiff of something. Alcohol. At this distance, I could see his eyes were slightly bloodshot. "Looks like your alternator's shot," he said after a moment. "You're not going anywhere tonight, I'm afraid." My heart sank. Oh no. Is there a town nearby where I could get it towed? He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Nearest town's about 40 miles that-a-way." He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "But don't you worry, pretty lady. I'd be happy to give you a ride." There it was again, that nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. His smile was a little too wide, his eyes a little too intense. "Oh, that's very kind of you," I said, stalling for time. "But I wouldn't want to impose. Maybe I could just call for a tow truck." "No cell service out here," he said, taking a step closer. "Come on, don't be shy. I don't bite." He grinned, and in the harsh glare of the headlights, it looked more like a leer. I took an involuntary step back. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll wait for another car to come by. My boyfriend is expecting me, you see. He'll be worried if I don't show up soon." The man's expression changed, just for a second. A flash of disappointment, anger. It was gone so quickly I thought I might have imagined it. "Boyfriend, huh?" he said, his tone still light but with an undercurrent of something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Well, we wouldn't want to keep him waiting. Are you sure I can't persuade you to accept a ride from Ola Chuck? It's mighty cold out here." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sure, but thank you. I'll be fine." He stood there for a moment, just looking at me. I fought the urge to shrink back, to run. Something in his gaze made me feel like prey being sized up by a predator. Finally, he shrugged. "Suit yourself. But here, let me at least check if I've got any tools that might help." Before I could protest, he turned and walked back to his truck. I watched, my heart pounding, as he opened the passenger side door and leaned in. That's when I saw it. In the cab of his truck, illuminated by the interior light, was a collection of items that made my blood run cold. Rope, duct tape, what looked like a hunting knife. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that if I got into that truck, I would never be seen again. Chuck straightened up, turning back towards me with something in his hand. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. I heard him shout behind me, his voice no longer friendly but filled with rage. The sound of heavy footsteps told me he was in pursuit. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning, my legs pumping. But where was I running to? There was nothing out here but fields and darkness. I veered off the road, hoping the uneven terrain would slow him down. I could hear him crashing through the tall grass behind me, getting closer. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw it. An old barn. Its weathered frame a darker shadow against the night sky. It was my only chance. I put on a final burst of speed, reaching the barn just as I heard Chuck's labored breathing right behind me. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and fumbling for a lock, a latch, anything. There was nothing. The old door didn't even fit properly in its frame anymore. I backed away, looking frantically for a place to hide. The barn was mostly empty, just some old farm equipment and piles of moldy hay. The door burst open, and there was Chuck, silhouetted against the night sky. His cap was gone, his hair wild, and in his hand was a wicked-looking knife. "Now why'd you have to go and do that?" he panted, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of rage and excitement. "We could have had such a nice time together." I grabbed the nearest object, an old pitchfork, and held it out in front of me. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "I swear I'll use this." He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the empty barn. Feisty. I like that. Makes it more fun. He lunged forward, faster than I would have thought possible for a man his size. I swung the pitchfork, more out of reflex than any real plan. By some miracle, it connected. Chuck howled in pain as one of the tines scraped across his face, drawing blood. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I bolted past him, back out into the night. But where could I go? My car was useless, and I was in the middle of nowhere. As I ran, a memory surfaced. An old episode of some true crime show. It said that if you were being chased, you should run towards lights, towards civilization. I searched the horizon desperately. There, in the distance, a faint glow. It could be a farmhouse, a gas station, anything. It was my only hope. I ran towards it, ignoring the burning in my lungs, the ache in my legs. Behind me, I could hear Chuck crashing through the fields, cursing loudly. The light grew brighter. As I got closer, I realized it was a house. A real normal-looking house with a porch light on and a car in the driveway. I used the last of my strength to sprint towards it, screaming at the top of my lungs. Help! Please! Somebody help me! The porch light flickered on, and the front door opened. An elderly couple peered out, looks of confusion turning to alarm as they saw me running towards them, followed by the hulking figure of Chuck. Call the police, I gasped as I reached them. Please, he's trying to kill me. The old man didn't hesitate. He ushered me inside and slammed the door, locking it securely. His wife was already on the phone with 911. We watched through the window as Chuck reached the edge of their property. He stood there for a moment, staring at the house with undisguised fury. Then, as the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, he turned and ran back towards the road. The police arrived a few minutes later, but Chuck and his truck were long gone. They took my statement and put out an APB, but I knew the chances of catching him were slim. As I sat on the old couple's couch, wrapped in a blanket and sipping tea with shaking hands, the reality of what had almost happened began to sink in. If I had accepted that ride, if I hadn't seen the contents of his truck, if I hadn't found that barn or this house, it's been 6 months since that night. They never caught Chuck, though there have been reports of similar incidents in other states. I still have nightmares sometimes, still find myself looking over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. But I also find myself appreciating life more. Every day feels like a gift, a second chance I nearly didn't get. I'm more cautious now, yes, but also more aware of the kindness of strangers. Real kindness, not the false friendliness of predators. So if you're ever stranded on a dark road and someone stops to help, trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. It's better to be alone than in the wrong company. And remember, sometimes the real heroes aren't the ones who offer a ride, but the ones who open their doors to a stranger in need. Be safe out there. The world can be a dangerous place, but it's also full of good people. The trick is learning to tell the difference. The moment I realized I was trapped in that house with a killer, I knew my job as a realtor had just become a fight for survival. What started as a routine open house turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. My name's Claire, and I've been selling houses for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all: fussy buyers, hidden structural problems, even the occasional ghost story. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that sunny Saturday afternoon in the quiet suburb of Maplewood. The house on Elm Street had been on the market for months. It was a beautiful Victorian, all gabled roofs and intricate woodwork, but it had a bit of a reputation. The previous owners had died there. Natural causes, I'd been assured, but it was enough to scare off most buyers. I'd decided to host an open house, hoping to drum up some interest. As I unlocked the front door that morning, I had a feeling it was going to be a long, uneventful day. The first few hours were exactly as I'd expected. A couple of curious neighbors, a young family clearly just browsing. an older gentleman who seemed more interested in the architecture than actually buying. By late afternoon, I was alone in the house, idly scrolling through my phone and thinking about packing up early. That's when he walked in. He was tall and well-dressed, with a charming smile that immediately put me at ease. "Am I too late for the open house?" he asked, and glancing at his watch. "Not at all," I replied, slipping into my professional persona. I was just about to close up, but I'd be happy to show you around. As we toured the house, he asked all the right questions about the foundation, the wiring, the history of the property. He seemed especially interested in the basement, commenting on its size and the sturdy lock on the door. "Privacy is very important to me," he explained with a wink. It wasn't until we reached the master bedroom on the second floor that I started to feel uneasy. He stood in the doorway, blocking my exit, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "This is perfect," he murmured. "Absolutely perfect." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Shall we head back downstairs? I can give you some information about making an offer if you're interested." He turned to me, and the look in his eyes made my blood run cold. The charm was gone, replaced by something predatory, calculating. "Oh, I'm definitely interested," he said, his voice low. "But not in buying the house." My heart started racing. I needed to get out of there, fast. "Well, if you're not looking to buy, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave. I have another appointment soon." He chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "No, you don't. I've been watching this house and watching you. I know you're alone here." I tried to push past him, but he was faster. In one fluid motion, he grabbed my arm and pushed me back into the room. I heard the click of a lock, and my panic surged. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "I want to play a game. This big, empty house. It's the perfect playground, don't you think?" I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. But the room had been staged for the open house. There was nothing personal, nothing heavy or sharp. "People will be looking for me," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "My office knows I'm here." He shook his head, almost sadly. "No, they don't. You were going to leave early, remember? No one's expecting to hear from you until Monday." My blood ran cold as I realized he was right. I told my boss I might close up early if it was slow. No one would miss me for days. "Now," he said, pulling a knife from his jacket pocket. "Shall we begin?" What followed was the most terrifying game of cat and mouse I've ever experienced. I managed to dodge past him and out of the bedroom, but I quickly realized I was trapped. He had locked and blocked the front door somehow, and the windows were all sealed shut, a charming original feature that I had praised to potential buyers just hours earlier. I ran from room to room, trying to find a way out, all the while hearing his footsteps, his taunting voice. Come out, wherever you are," he called, like this was all some twisted game of hide and seek. At one point, I thought I had outsmarted him. I hid in a hall closet, holding my breath as I heard him walk past. But just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, the door flew open. He had been waiting, silent, for me to relax. I screamed and shoved past him, my fear giving me strength I didn't know I had. I ran for the stairs, my only thought to get to the second floor, to find a room with a window I could break. I made it to the guest bedroom and slammed the door shut, wedging a chair under the handle. I could hear him coming up the stairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He knew I had nowhere to go. With shaking hands, I tried to open the window. It was painted shut, decades of layers sealing it firmly in place. I looked around desperately for something to break the glass. That's when I saw it, an old fireplace poker leaning against the decorative fireplace. I grabbed it just as the door began to splinter under his assault. "You're only making this harder on yourself," he called through the crack in the door. "Why don't you just accept it? No one's coming to save you." But as he finally broke through the door, I was ready. I swung the poker with all my might. connecting squarely with his head. He went down hard, the knife clattering to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he was out cold. I ran past him, down the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I made it to the front door and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear him groaning upstairs, starting to stir. In desperation, I grabbed a heavy candlestick from the entryway table and smashed it against the small window pane in the door. The glass shattered, and I reached through, not caring as the jagged edges cut into my arm. I managed to unlock the door just as I heard him stumbling down the stairs. I burst out onto the porch, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. A neighbor out walking his dog saw me and immediately called 911. Within minutes, the quiet street was filled with police cars and ambulances. They caught him trying to escape through the backyard. It turned out he was wanted in 3 states for similar attacks. The police found evidence in his car that suggested I wasn't his first target, and I certainly wouldn't have been his last. The aftermath was a blur of hospital visits, police statements, and therapy sessions. I couldn't sleep for weeks, jumping at every sound, seeing his face every time I closed my eyes. It's been 2 years since that day. I don't work in real estate anymore. I couldn't face the thought of being alone in empty houses. But slowly, I'm rebuilding my life. I've become an advocate for realtor safety, speaking at conferences and pushing for better protections for agents working alone. Sometimes, I drive past that house on Elm Street. It's occupied now, a young family bringing new life to the old rooms. They don't know what happened there, and I hope they never have to. I often think about how close I came to being another statistic, another mysterious disappearance. If I hadn't found that fireplace poker, if the neighbor hadn't been walking his dog at that exact moment. But I try not to dwell on the what-ifs. Instead, I focus on the lessons I learned. Trust your instincts. Always have an escape plan. And never underestimate the strength you have inside you, even in the most terrifying moments. To my fellow realtors out there, please be careful. That charming potential buyer might not be what they seem. Always let someone know where you are. Consider bringing a colleague to open houses. It might seem like overkill, but believe me, it's better to be overly cautious than to find yourself living a nightmare. And to everyone else, remember that bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about facing that fear and fighting through it. We're all stronger than we know. Sometimes it just takes a life or death situation to realize it. I survived that day on Elm Street. I outsmarted a killer and lived to tell the tale. It's not a story I ever wanted to have, but it's mine. And if sharing it can help keep even one person safe, then maybe some good can come from that terrifying game of cat and mouse in an empty house on a sunny Saturday.